Hello everyone, my name is Mel Harrison and I'm one of the organisers. Welcome to the second day of the Criposium. This event is a collaboration between students from King's College London and SOAS, University of London. Our aims are to challenge hegemonic discourses of normalcy that define disabled bodies and bodies of difference as abnormal or transgressive, to explore how ableism intersects with other forms of oppressions such as racism, sexism, trans and homophobia, and class inequalities, and to bring disabled academics and activists together into conversation about how to build solidarity across these multiple marginalised groups. We do this by centering intersectional disabled experiences in art, activism, and academia. Today, by a panel on disabled identities and representation in the media. We will then have a 30-minute break, during which you are welcome to browse the virtual gallery on our website. After the break, we have a panel about healthcare and disability, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations in all these panels. The closing address of this event will be delivered by Olajumoke J. Abdullahi and Kim Oliver of Triple Cripples. The Criposium is organised and run by myself and Christina Lee from King's College London and Manishta from SOAS Centre for Gender Studies. Christina is the manager of the live stream and she will ensure that the virtual operations run smoothly. Manishta and I will manage the participants, the volunteers, and all our social media platforms to ensure that everybody is supported throughout the day. There will be captioning and BSL interpretation. During the live Q&A, when captioning is sometimes unreliable, the discussion will be transcribed in a live chat. The whole event will be recorded, and after the event, a copy of the recording and the transcript will be sent to everybody who registered. During the Q&A, you can participate in 3 ways. Comment in the YouTube live chat, ask on Twitter @Criposium, or use the online Google form. The link is in the video description if you wish to remain anonymous. If there are any problems, please let us know either in the live chat or DM us on Twitter @Criposium. The hashtag for today is #Criposium, and if you have questions for the panels or the speakers, you can tweet using #CriposiumQA. As this is a live stream, you are free to pause, rewind, or watch live straight through. Please do take a break whenever you need to. There will be transcriptions on the side in the live chat, so you can catch up quickly if you do take a break. The programme of today's events can be found on our website, criposium.wordpress.com. Finally, the Criposium is a virtual event and is open to everyone, regardless of disability, sexual, race, class, identity, nationality, education, or institutional affiliation. This event centres ideas about Crip and its intersections. We will strive to make the event as accessible and as inclusive as possible. To do this, we ask that everybody is respectful to each other and to make this an inclusive and safe space. Please bear in mind that this event is not a platform to debate the legitimacy of sexual or gender identities, and please refrain from making classist, transphobic, queerphobic, racist, sexist, or ableist comments. Before commenting on sensitive topics, please give trigger warnings. This includes mentions of pandemic and lockdown.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a reminder to speak slowly and clearly if possible to help our wonderful BSL interpreters as much as possible. Our BSL interpreters today are Ali, doing the interpretation now, and Sandy, who you'll meet later. They will be swapping between themselves throughout the afternoon. The active BSL interpreter will be spotlighted on the video. If you need any help or assistance with that, please either message Manishta or myself, or if you'd like to speak to one of the BSL interpreters, please do message them as well. If you need any help with technical issues on Zoom, or you're having trouble accessing anything, again, please do message either myself or Manishta, and we will do our best to help. So we'll get started today with our first panel on media and identity, moderated by Rhianna Walcott from King's College London. Rhianna, if you're ready, then we'd love to get started.
Hi there, welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Rhianna Walcott from King's College London. I'm a third-year PhD looking at Black feminism and digital identity online. So I also edited an anthology called The Colour of Madness, and that is an anthology exploring BAME mental health in the UK. So just to during the presentations, please feel free to tweet using the hashtags #Criposium and #Criposium Q&A if you'd like to partake in the Q&A. Alternatively, please write your questions in the Zoom chat, and you can also ask questions anonymously using the Google form posted in the chat. Okay, so I'll introduce our first presentation. That's Caroline Darke from the University of Stirling, and the first is called Superhumans Superbrand, Exploring the Mythology of Channel 4's Paralympic Superhumans in Relation to the Representations of Gender and Social Constructions of Disability. So the tags for those are Paralympics, Sport, Gender, Media, Super Crip, and Acceptable Disability.
Hi, my name's Caroline Darke, and I'm going to talk to you today about intersectional representation in disability sports media. Specifically, my research focuses on gender and gendered disability as depicted within Channel 4's marketing campaigns for the London 2012 and Rio 2016 Paralympics. This research looked primarily at the two promotional television adverts created by Channel 4, Meet the Superhumans, which launched for London 2012, and We're the Superhumans, which promoted Rio 2016. These adverts form the backbone of Channel 4's Paralympic Superhumans brand, a brand that has not only gained the UK broadcaster widespread critical and public acclaim, but which has now become synonymous with elite disability sports coverage on a global scale, and which has penetrated both the visual and spoken language around much disability representation within the UK mainstream media. But what I'm really interested in is whether this brand is as groundbreaking, risk-taking, boundary-pushing and transformative as it claims to be, or whether in reality it relies on familiar and established tropes of supposed acceptable disability and on conventions of gender bias and gendered representation as witnessed throughout most mainstream sports coverage. A bias that's been called out by feminist sports academics for over 50 years. Using an intersectional framework grounded in critical disability studies, my research seeks to answer three key questions. 1, is the narrative of Channel 4's Paralympic Superhuman gendered? If so, how, and what might this mean for the representation and social perception of disabled female athletes? 2, how useful is the superhuman narrative to the disability cause? Who does it serve? Who is visible? Who is left out? And what effect might this have on shaping and reinforcing public stereotypes and established models of disability? And 3, who get to be the experts in the narrative construction and visual characterisation of Channel 4's Paralympic Superhuman? So in order to try and answer these questions, I undertook a comparative, quantitative content analysis of the Meet the Superhumans and We're the Superhumans adverts, and a quantitative and narrative content analysis of Channel 4's associated press releases and evaluation documents, as supplied to me by the Channel 4 archives team. Essentially, this means that I used the adverts and press releases as my primary source material and divided the characters depicted within these sources into specific categories and types. I then counted the number of times each of these types appeared in order to see who exactly was represented by Channel 4's Paralympic campaigns and how. Before getting into what this analysis revealed, I thought it would be useful to provide a little context to the project and why I was interested to explore it. So prior to London 2012, the contract for television coverage of the Paralympic Games in the UK was automatically given to whoever won the broadcasting rights for the Olympics. This basically meant that the BBC had, up until this point, been the UK broadcaster for every Paralympic Games that had been deemed worthy of televising. Whilst interest in these games had been increasing with every incarnation, especially since Sydney 2000, mainstream coverage of the Paralympics was still very much represented as a minimal afterthought, a kind of tag-on event to the Olympics, much like the allocation of the games themselves. In London 2012, the London Organising Committee took the radical decision to separately tender the UK broadcasting rights for the Olympics and the Paralympics, leading to the emergence of Channel 4 as the new provider of Paralympic coverage in the UK and the rise of their Superhumans super brand. With the promise to deliver more coverage than ever before and an ambition to use the Games to, quote, bring about a fundamental and permanent shift in people's perception of disability, unquote, Channel 4 has certainly upped the ante in terms of public visibility and recognition of disability sport in the UK, successfully shifting the Paralympics from the margins to the mainstream and dramatically elevating the profile of disabled athletes amongst the British general public. The Superhumans brand, and in particular the London 2012 and Rio 2016 marketing campaigns, have been seen as a key part of this success, deploying a rhetoric of being groundbreaking, risk-taking, transformative, inspirational, bold, edgy and authentic. This rhetoric has been picked up and reinforced by the global television and media industry, numerous high-profile sports governing bodies and the UK mainstream press, leading to multiple industry awards for Channel 4 for their innovative and thought-provoking work, and the creation of a new mythology around Channel 4 as being the global experts when it comes to the presentation of disability sport and the championing of disabled people within the mainstream media. However, there are some elements of this mythology that I find highly problematic. One of the main issues I have is to do with what I perceive to be a lack of diversity in the types of disabled people represented, particularly with regards to a lack of gender parity. This focus no doubt comes from my own standpoint as a disabled woman, a former parasport athlete and a feminist. However, I make no apologies for any of that. The other main issue I have is around the superheroing of Paralympic athletes through the dominance of a typical triumph over adversity narrative and the constant promotion of the inspirational super Crip identity, both of which can be seen as key traits in the more acceptable notions of disability within a mainstream non-disabled social and political agenda. Whilst I appreciate that there is something extraordinary about being a person or team of people at the very pinnacle of sporting achievement on an international stage, there is another side to the superhuman narrative which, to my mind, has particularly dangerous repercussions when applied to the world of disability. This is to do with the shifting dominance of the three main models of disability, as recognised within much academic and social theory. That is the medical model, the social model and the cultural model. And I'm sure that everyone listening today is familiar with these concepts, but just in case you're not, basically the medical model focuses on disability as an individualised, pathologised condition that needs to be categorised, managed, fixed or overcome in order for the disabled individual to be accepted within and given access to supposedly, quote, normal society. This fix often comes through the intervention of technology, for example, the use of calipers, prosthetics and wheelchairs. In contrast, the social model focuses on the idea of disability as a form of social and political oppression rather than being the fault and or responsibility of an individual with a physical or intellectual impairment. This model forms much of the basis of today's social policies around disability, but has been criticised by some within the disabled community for providing a one-size-fits-all, homogenised view of disabled experience. The cultural model, which emerged in the 1990s, takes its root from the social model, but refutes the notion of some kind of universal disabled identity, instead acknowledging that there may be multiple coexisting cultural and experiential factors that can affect a disabled person's life. These include, but are not limited to, their gender, race, age, class, religion, geographical location and/or sexuality, as well as their disability. In this way, the cultural model can be seen to draw heavily on the concept of intersectionality, whilst also recognising the influence that stereotypes, historical precedents and popular media representations play in shaping or denying different types of narratives of disability within mainstream society. Having considered these three models, my concern therefore with the Super Crip or Superhuman, as presented by Channel 4, is that it shifts the focus from the social and cultural models of disability back onto the old-fashioned institutional medical model, whereby it is up to the individual to overcome their disability in order to succeed, and where the disabled body becomes an anomaly that has to be defined and explained in order to be appreciated and accepted by non-disabled society. This trajectory is utilised throughout Channel 4's Superhumans brand by their heavy reliance on character backstories or journeys, as exemplified here by some of the framing screenshots taken from the Meet the Superhumans commercial. It is also demonstrated through the emergence and widely celebrated public success of the Lexi decoder, which you can see here at the bottom right of the screen. Invented by former Paralympic swimmer Giles Long, this decoder is a visual infographic that launched as part of Channel 4's London 2012 coverage. It seeks to explain the different impairment categories under which each Paralympian competes, using a traffic light system of red for highly impaired, amber for partially impaired, and green for no impairments. In this way, the decoder aims to demystify disability for the non-disabled viewer and to explain why athletes with different kinds of impairments compete with or against each other. The complexity of Paralympic impairment categories and classifications had, up until this point, supposedly been a major reason why the British general public had failed to get behind Paralympic sport in any meaningful way. As such, Lexi has been heralded by the mainstream press as being a key reason why Channel 4's Paralympic coverage succeeded to capture the public imagination, where other campaigns had failed. However, I would argue that this cycle of classification, explanation and categorisation, along with the reinforcement of the Superhumans' triumph over adversity narratives, helps reinforce established notions of acceptable disability and disability stereotypes rather than indulging in groundbreaking, risk-taking or transformative representations of disability. So now to get to the question of who exactly is represented within Channel 4's 2012 and 2016 Paralympic campaigns, and specifically does this representation demonstrate a gendered campaign? To explore this, I used my comparative quantitative data analysis, breaking down each of Channel 4's Paralympic commercials into their respective number of shots and frames in order to count the number of male and female characters represented, the number of male and female focused narrative shots, the amount of time given to each gender's representation within each commercial. These results were then represented as a percentage of their total value across each advert, which you can see demonstrated in this table. This exercise was repeated using the secondary materials, so the press releases and evaluation documents, using a slightly different criteria of the number of male and female characters represented, the number of male to female focused documents in terms of narrative content, and the number of male to female quoted experts or company representatives within the documentation. Essentially, the results of this data analysis clearly demonstrate a pattern of significant gender bias in favour of disabled male athletes and characters and male narratives throughout both the Superhumans adverts and supporting documentation. This is evident across both the 2012 and 2016 campaigns and all 6 of the coding structures I just listed. It is particularly obvious within the 2012 commercial, where objects and object shots were actually given more weight than female athletes, claiming an equal number of focus shots as the women, so 14 each out of a total 78, and a higher percentage of total airtime, 25% for objects as opposed to 17% for women. In relation to whether the later campaign shows any progress towards gender equality, this same data reveals that whilst the percentage of disabled female characters featured in 2016's We Are the Superhumans does marginally increase, highlighted here in red, as does their narrative focus, the amount of airtime given to females within this commercial is effectively reduced from 17% of total frames in 2012 to 14% in 2016. Meanwhile, the proportion of male representation in 2016 actually rises from 53% in 2012 to 59% in 2016 in terms of narrative focus, and 44% of total frames in 2012 to 66% of total frames in 2016 in terms of airtime. See the figures highlighted here in blue. This demonstrates an increasing gender bias in 2016's campaign, rather than a move towards greater parity of representation. To me, this situation serves to massively undermine British female Paralympians and their sporting achievements, as well as denigrating their value in terms of audience admiration and focus. It also demonstrates how entrenched this problem of gender bias is in terms of visual representation and who holds the power. So in terms of this power, I was also interested to find out who get to be the experts within both the Channel 4's campaigns and behind the scenes. Now, whilst these two images, which are taken from Channel 4's 2012 evaluation document, may aim to demonstrate the supposed diversity within the generation of new presenting talent and established Channel 4 broadcasting team, in reality, the total of the total 62 people quoted in Channel 4's 2012 and 2016 supporting documentation, only one is identifiable as a disabled female, one is an able-bodied female, and one is a disabled male. In contrast, 38 are identifiable as able-bodied white men. This includes the CEO of the British Paralympic Association, the chairman of the London Organising Committee, the president of Sochi 2014, the president of Rio 2016, Channel 4's chief executive, Channel 4's commissioning executive for sport, Channel 4's director of creative diversity, the heads of 4 Creative, the chief marketing and communications officer for Channel 4, and the filmmaker of the 2012 Superhumans documentary, The Journey. These numbers clearly evidence a systematic, systemic and endemic gender bias within disabled sports and sports media that extends well beyond what is shown on camera, but which also demonstrates how few disabled people are A, in positions of power and influence within disabled sports media and international sporting governing bodies, B, part of the creative team responsible for coming up with the Superhumans narratives and brand identity. This is important because no matter how many disabled people you show on TV or how many female Paralympic athletes or presenters you claim to highlight, without greater numbers of disabled people, and in particular disabled women, in positions of power and influence within sport and sports media, the narrative around disability representation, and in particular gender disability, is very unlikely to ever really and effectively change. Now, while some critics will no doubt contend that this lack of gender parity within Channel 4's Paralympic campaigns represents the true proportionality of male to female Paralympic competitors at both London and Rio, for indeed male Team GB athletes did outnumber female an average of 61 to 39%. I would argue that without equal public representation, women are far less likely to ever achieve gender parity with men, both within the fields of professional disabled sport and sports reporting. They are also less likely to be treated as seriously as male competitors or to win lucrative sponsorship and/or media contracts as a result. This matters because, one, it is both an unequal and unfair representation of British female Paralympians, especially given their success at both the 2012 and 2016 Games, where they actually outperformed their male compatriots, claiming 18 out of 34 British golds at London 2012, 40 out of 64 British golds at Rio 2016, and more podium places at both competitions than the men, despite making up less than half of the total team numbers. Also, the most successful British Paralympian of the modern era is a woman whose name is Sarah Storey, former swimmer turned cyclist and pictured here, who, despite winning her 14th gold medal at Rio 2016, barely gets a mention in either of Channel 4's Paralympic campaigns. Secondly, it serves to highlight the inauthenticity of the diversity rhetoric utilised by Channel 4 throughout their Paralympic campaigns, particularly given the evident gender stereotyping and his systemic representational and power biases demonstrated throughout, both on and off the screen. 3, with essentially a clean slate to work with, Channel 4 had a unique opportunity not only to rewrite how disabled people and disability sport were represented within mainstream media and culture, but also to challenge long-established gender norms regarding how female athletes, sports presenters and media experts are treated within what remains a rampantly sexist institution, i.e. that of professional sport and sports media. They also had a major opportunity here to promote new kinds of disability role models with the potential to influence who is most likely to become involved with and to succeed in disability sport in the future. Number 4, it fails to acknowledge the power and influence the media has in helping shape public perceptions of disability and gender, thereby affecting social behaviours, attitudes and expectations. And lastly, it fails to also acknowledge the power and influence the media have in helping shape social policies around disability, particularly in relation to the various models of disability discussed throughout this paper. These policies have a huge influence and effect on disabled people's everyday lives, helping shape political, social and economic agendas well beyond the boundaries of sport and entertainment. Of course, it's not just female athletes who are failed here by Channel 4's 2012 and 2016 Superhumans campaigns and branding. It's also people of colour, people with less, quote, palatable, visible or acceptable disabilities, older athletes and those with non-heteronormative sexual identities. There is also the much suppressed issue of class and geography in the disability sport, and in particular those sports and classifications that require access to high-level technologies are only really available to those nations and individuals with money and access to cutting-edge technology such as high-performance wheelchairs, high-tech prosthetics and carbon fibre blades. However, to end on a more positive note, I do not highlight all of this to denigrate the work of Channel 4 so far, for I believe they have gone a long way beyond any other broadcaster in the UK in their representation of disabled people, and that their coverage of the Paralympic Games since 2012 has helped elevate the general British public's awareness and appreciation of disability sport, as well as increasing the visibility of disabled people across the British mainstream media. I just think that it's only certain kinds of disabled people who currently stand to really benefit from this kind of exposure and focus, i.e. primarily white, male, super Crip athletes and sports personalities. I also believe that as a public service broadcaster, they can and need to do more if they really want to fulfil their mission to, quote, bring about a fundamental and permanent shift in people's perception of disability, unquote, and to offer a genuinely risk-taking, transformative, innovative, inclusive and diverse agenda within the representation of mainstream disability sports and sports personalities. My hopes are therefore that by highlighting some of the current disparities, biases and lack of intersectional representation within their Paralympic brand and framework, we can help encourage 1. More women and disabled people into positions of power and influence within disability sports governing bodies and disability sports media. 2. More women and disabled people in decision-making panels around which disability narratives get chosen and how characters are represented in future Paralympic campaigns. 3. To encourage greater diversity and recognition of intersectional disabled identities and types of disability that are visible and talked about within mainstream sports media, particularly with regards to promotion of selected star athletes and TV presenting teams. And finally, to encourage a greater diversity of disability characters and narratives evident within mainstream disability sports reporting, with less prominence given to the inspirational Crip Super Crip and the triumph over adversity agendas. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Izzy, and before I begin, I just want to briefly draw attention to a quick content warning. I will be mentioning autistic abuse in this presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about a behaviour you may or may not be familiar with called stimming. I'm going to start by discussing stimming, its history, and its relationship with Western representations of autism. Then I will position these ideas in conversation with a video performance of stimming by Amanda Baggs called In My Language, which challenges the cultural autistic discourse of lack and otherness. Finally, I'm going to extrapolate from Baggs's metaphor of language to suggest how stimming might totally subvert how we think about communication, how we construct neuroqueer identity, and how we approach difference more broadly. Stimming is shorthand for self-stimulatory behaviour, commonly associated with autism and other disabilities that have a sensory processing component. The American Psychiatric Association describes stimming as stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms, and some of the most recognisable examples include hand flapping, repeated noises, clapping, hard blinking, rocking, and clicking. This is driven by the impulse to self-soothe, alleviate overstimulation, and regulate emotions. In fact, if you've ever found yourself relieving energy by tapping your foot, repeatedly running your hands through your hair, or biting your nails, you have also engaged in a form of stimming behaviour. The term has a fraught status within the autistic community today. Although it is increasingly falling out of favour with medical and educational professionals, behavioural therapies for autistic people have historically suppressed stimming with the term quiet hands. However innocuous this phrase might seem, it refers to an abusive and traumatic social conditioning used to prevent behaviours which are classified as unruly or disruptive. Autism activists have described having their hands duct taped, strapped down to their chair, or physically held down by caregivers upon the recommendation of trained professionals, a practice which is at best uncomfortable and at worst excruciatingly painful. Essentially, this was predicated upon trying to make autistic people conform to a standard of normativity. The quiet hands policy symbolises a neurotypical amputation of anything deemed other, leading to a culture in which masking, the strategy of disguising autistic traits in order to pass as neurotypical, is actively encouraged. This has spilled out into a glorification of the category high-functioning autism, which functions alongside an alienation of any manifestation of autism that doesn't mimic the neurotypical standard. It is with this in mind that I want to draw your attention to a recurring characteristic of cultural representations of autism, or rather, the absence of one. Mainstream autism discourse orbits around negation, absence, and a lack of social skills, a lack of eye contact, and certainly a lack of representation. The archetypal white male genius dominates TV and film representations, and even then there appears a reluctance to officially recognise these characters as autistic. I'm sure the Big Bang Theory's Sheldon Cooper springs to mind for some of you. Temple Grandin, a livestock scientist, author, and perhaps one of the most well-known autistic voices, describes how Western mainstream understandings of autism are driven by negation. She says that the focus on deficits is so intense and so automatic that people lose sight of the strengths of autistic people. The same is true of disability more broadly. When the disabled person is held up against the fantasy of the normative body and mind, they are read for the qualities they lack, they are translated as deficient. The process of comparison to this fantasy is the process by which autistic identity is produced in the mainstream. This means that one's innate sense of self is dislocated, as identity is effectively produced outside of the self, located externally to the individual. This process of identity translation and formation is something which Amanda Baggs addresses in her 2007 YouTube performance called In My Language, where she performs stimming for some time and then intervenes to offer a translation of her actions. The following is a short clip which shows several scenes of Baggs stimming with household objects like a keyboard and a slinky, flapping her hands and rocking as she vocalizes rhythmically. Bags says that while she is stimming, she is not in a world of her own, as the neurotypical world might perceive. For her, stimming is not a closed and unilateral process of self-stimulation. Instead, Bags thinks of stimming as a form of communication, calling it her native language. In her interactions with water, fabric, keyboards, books, and air, she demonstrates how stimming functions as a series of connected, interactive dialogues with her environment. Bags's sensual engagements with her surroundings may seem completely random, but they are methodical and systematic processes. She explains later in the video that her sensorial response of touching, or vocalizing, or listening is selected in accordance with each object or situation. One of the later scenes depicts Bags running the water from her tap over her hand. The water flows over, around, and between her fingers, which dance in response to this sensation. Bags says later that this is a dialogue where both object and subject are locked into an interaction with one another. Her explanation is brilliantly insightful. She specifically points out that this part of the video doesn't symbolize anything. Her physical play with the water is not designed to be decoded or solved. In fact, she goes to great lengths to disentangle her native language from normative linguistic structures, where separate words contain separate meanings to be deciphered and interpreted by an outsider into their own vernacular. Thus, stimming is a native language which short-circuits our ideas about how language itself functions. Social and political trends are baked into language. It marks out a group of the included at the expense of the excluded. Native languages act to reinforce national borders, act to privilege certain accents, often othering immigrants and buttressing class stratification. And of course, in its function as a social agent, conventional language can alienate the neurodivergent. Bags's native language of stimming is powerful then because it collapses all these arbitrary linguistic hierarchies and stratifications into a more authentic relationality with her environment. She explains that her stimming is about being in a constant conversation with every aspect of my environment, relating physically to all parts of my surroundings. This is why stimming becomes a powerful method of identity formation within and against a hostile neurotypical world. Bags calls conventional communication limited when held up against a spectrum of total relationality produced by stimming. Reclaiming stimming in this context as natural and authentic, as Bags does, is a retrieval of agency. She deconstructs the idiom of lack and otherness in which autism is so often expressed to convert this othering into a kind of liberation from the neurotypical gaze. The neurotypical viewer is constantly reminded of themselves as an outsider to her performance, rather than a cosy kind of voyeur. She refuses to frame her work as an anthropological exploration of autism, to sanitize it into something safe and familiar. It isn't until midway through that Baggs begins to explain her stimming in the section called A Translation, and these explanations absolutely refuse to compromise with the label of mysterious and puzzling, which the neurotypical world assigns to her. In this way, her performance reframes representations of stimming and autism. As Baggs herself asserts, her behaviour is not purposeless, but redefines the criteria by which we judge and perceive the purpose of language and communication. Baggs undermines the conventional language by undermining its central assumption, that it is a human institution. Stimming circumvents the anthropocentric structure of conventional language, a focus on the human at the expense of every other kind of relationality. Baggs's stimming is a more immersive, authentic mode of being. This reminds me of a famous quote from Martin Heidegger, which asserts that language is the house of being. In other words, on the most basic level, our sense of self is produced in language. Baggs's performance of stimming offers us radical new ways of thinking and perceiving selfhood. She seeks an ecological resolution to the question of identity. Ecology is a branch of philosophy which proposes a way of understanding ourselves through our relationship with our environment. It describes consciousness which is not limited to the individual person, but is always considered in symbiosis and relationality with the world around us. It is a more horizontal axis of being that doesn't privilege the human over their surroundings, but understands them as an interacting ecosystem of relationships and symbiosis. This proposes a model of identity which is produced in our relationship with space, which is invested in the individual's own senses, movements, choices, and feelings, rather than via comparison with an impossible standard of normativity. I'm certain that by focusing on stimming discourse in its ability to deconstruct the hierarchies of conventional language, we could even go beyond the agency of identity formation. The radical empathy and relationality with our environments that Baggs associates with stimming invites disability discourse into alliances with the contemporary struggles of environmentalism in our current struggle against the climate crisis. My point is that the lack and deficiency which neurotypical culture inscribes into autism is only a product of this culture itself, and that by recognising this and celebrating rather than smothering it, identity can be emancipated to power and subversion. I want to conclude with a quote from Julia Bascom, an autistic advocate and founder of the Loud Hands Project in New Hampshire, about her relationship with her stimming hands. She says, "My hands know things the rest of me doesn't. They type words, sentences, stories, worlds that I didn't know I thought. They tell me what I think, what I know, what I remember. When I'm brought to a new place, my fingers tap out the walls and tables and chairs and counters. They skim over the paper and make me laugh. They press against each other and remind me that I am real. They drum and produce sound to remind me of cause and effect. My fingers map out a world and then they make it real. My hands are more me than I am."
Thank you so much. That was Izzy Cherry from King's College London on My Native Language, what is stimming, and how does it change the conversation surrounding neuroqueer identity formation. Next up, we've got Andrea Gómez from Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Ooh. And this is ¿Por qué dices Crip? Reflections about Crip theory in Latin America. And the tags on that are Crip, disability, Latin America, and disability theory.
Hello, my name is Andrea Gómez. I am a Peruvian autistic woman currently concluding my PhD program in anthropology here in Mexico City. Sorry if I'm looking to the side in order to read the script. In 2018, I first heard the word Crip. It was in the middle of a university seminar about disability. McClure's Crip theory was mandatory reading. From that point on, I have noticed this word being mentioned, mostly in academic and extremely few activist circles. As Platero and Rosón mentioned, the term Crip emerges in an Anglo-Saxon context. Its nuances are not evident in Spanish because it is devoid of the burden of injury. It does not generate an emotional response when listening to it. Crip theory criticizes social and medical models of disability, admitting that disability has been conceived in various ways globally. It locates disabled/Crip experiences in the bodies of people in an inaccessible milieu. McClure states, Crip theory does not seek to dematerialize disability identity. Coming out Crip allows for the emergence of new disabled subjectivities. So it might seem paradoxical that its use has started to be disseminated and placed at the forefront of scholarly and militant discussions while keeping Crip as the term to employ. While discussing Crip theory, it will be naive to ignore the power imbalance from which it profits. Crip, just like queer, is part of the imported terminology that has found a place in Latin American discourse. Theoretical production from the United States and parts of Europe has been prioritized constantly. Chandra Mohanty talks about discursive colonization, certain form of appropriation and codification of academic production and knowledge about those located in the third world. She argues textual strategies codify a non-Occidental other, incite a structural suppression and a continuous ideological dominance reflected in many ways. An example is that I am speaking to you in English, a language I was taught since I was 5 years old, while the languages my Muchik, Quechua, and Cantonese ancestors spoke were not part of my school curriculum and were no longer used at home. Silvia Rivera goes further into the issue, bringing up that this inequality works as an economy of ideas, salaries, amenities, and privileges, as well as a certifier of values. It lends itself very well to the exercise of clientelismo. A close translation would be political patronage, as a mode of colonial domination. Through the game of who quotes who, hierarchies are structured. In my opinion, Crip theory can be found in this context. It has prospered in my continent due to our epistemic cartography, as Jesus Santos says. It is a model of subjective exclusion that prevails today. Returning to the word queer, Norma Mogrovejo has bluntly stated it. It came to Latin America in the mid-1990s as an academic reflection rather than a necessity. It sounds cool in colonial languages, always ready to find more fashionable what is said if it is imported, even if it is an insult. The pretense that avoiding a nameable identity is a tool to fight normalcy comes from a comprehension of the world that does not seem to grasp Latin American realities. While the label disability is being replaced in certain settings by functional, mental, and neurodiversities, some labels referring to gender as sexuality are being left behind for sexual diversity. In both cases, there are critiques about how this terminology depoliticizes the fights and burdens of the individuals they supposedly include. There are, however, Latin American authors who defend the use of queer, like Sayak Valencia. According to her, queer in its Spanialized version, supposes a geopolitical look towards the south from the peripheries. Its theory would be advantageous when studying capitalist subjectivities and new discursive figures. But from what peripheries are we talking about? Many Latin American countries have been in war with each other, some have occupied others, and they do not share the same level of financial resources or public infrastructures. More precisely, not all of us share the same access to education. As Bembe remarks, colonization is characterized by the violence of ignorance. It is a prodigious machine producing desires and fantasies. Crip and queer terminology is elitist. In the context where I am situated, it is one element of closed cultural realms, largely exclusive to dominant groups. If Crip avows for a political and relational model, a potential site for collective reimagining as CAFER rights, then it should be accessible and relevant to all of us who could benefit from it. It can be said that disability is foreign and does not pertain to the issues faced in Latin America. That is correct. Nevertheless, the term has been present for so long in my region that it would be ludicrous of me to pretend it can cease to be used. But disability is different from Crip. To effectively communicate the substantial impact Crip has in English, which terms do we have in Latin America? One is tullido. In the same seminar where I learned about Crip was where I first heard it. Tullido in Peru does not mean anything, but in certain countries like Spain, Mexico, or Honduras, it's close to crippled. Tullido appears in many books and peer-reviewed articles in Spanish as an equivalent to Crip, because from the first two countries, more publications about disability have been written, edited, and circulated. Another word is lisiado, which is commonly said as an insult in many places in Latin America. If we are looking for nomenclature accompanied by analytical propositions, one would be monstruo or monster in English. It has historical and social connotations as a figure which transgresses the laws and norms of the prevailing social order, schemes that are extremely effective in the exercise of uniformity and sanctioning what is different. The valence in the word monstruo is profound. It has not only been used for non-heterosexual, gender non-conforming and or non-presenting individuals for centuries, it was written in the early chronicles of the Conquista to describe American inhabitants, their gods, their material culture, their domesticated fauna, and the geography where they were established, for example, the Amazon River. Monstruo is currently a deeply capacitist word, regularly found in newspaper articles when they cover violences against women, especially physical violence, and practices from faiths and belief systems outside the Catholic Church. Just as our republics need to pathologize those who they do not want to take responsibility for, the Church needs opposing beings to operate its healings and miracles. Another proposition, which originally is not addressed to disability issues, is The Visible and Hidden Sides by Maria Lugones. She tackles gender polarities and hegemonic heterosexuality, contending that they are at the center of a modern and colonial system in previously occupied territories. The resulting societies require a multiplicity of perspectives put together, not geometrically as intersectionality proposes, but in a fluid interrelation. Lugones has written against the separation of oppressions, favoring a logic of fusion. Here, the visible or the clear side is the part we can observe as products of that system. Sexual passivity in women, the demand to be pure and responsible for their progenies, where bourgeois and white or whiter women reproduce class and social positions of the men affiliated to them. The hidden or the dark side contains the labor exploitation of women and of those not affiliated to either gender category and or heterosexuality, forcing them to be materially and symbolically reduced. On the strength of its openness, I believe Gómez's proposition can help to study capacitism and exclusions resulting from the assumption and the incarnation of disability. And it also helps to explain how disabled people are situated in heterogeneous locations of power in Latin America. And now that I have said disabled people, I would like to point out that the debates around first person or third person identity have not transpired into the social arena here, from state agencies, which can provide financial bonuses, to private universities that give accommodations. They all use third-person vocabulary. Identity is not only an exercise of subjectivity, but alterity matters. What is the practical weight of a term that will not have a material impact? More importantly, who are the ones who can afford to ruminate about this debate in my region? We, the ones who have not been abandoned by our families, who are not living in the streets, who are not tied to trees to be left to die, the ones who have income, the ones whose mother tongue is not an indigenous language, the ones who can read and write in Spanish, in English. I recognize my privileges in my own local context. That might not seem so for you. A mostly Anglo-speaking public. As someone who comes from poverty, and a child who lived among terrorism, and lives in one of the most infamous countries because of its femicides and its drug cartels, do I seem privileged to you? To conclude, Crip possesses a history and a significance that are situated externally, and its theoretical and advocacy applications do not necessarily match with experiences faced by Latin American disabled people. Additionally, Crip is part of foreign nomenclature preferentially discussed and studied in countries still seen as dependent of the United States and sections of European academia. Crip theory and identity is in danger of falling into a historic setup where many other foreign scholarly contributions become standard references, while analysis produced in Latin America is dragged to a footnote or used as a case study, never as a theory. Other terms and approaches have been claimed as points of departure. I only mentioned two here. Both directly confront how individuals are impacted by gender, class, race, among others. If there is something that I wish you can keep from my presentation, is the following. Discussing Crip theory and identity's privileges does not undermine its analytical and critical validity. My goal and my proposition to you is to break the Crip umbrella. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that as well. So that was Andrea Gómez with reflections about Crip theory in Latin America. So now we're opening up to questions. If you have any questions, please do feel free to pop those in the chat or on the Twitter thread or through using the Google form. So I'd like to just start this off by talking to some of the similarities across those papers. So thinking about things like intersectionality across those three papers, and how representation of different backgrounds in the channel 4 media versus the intersection of different class and gender disparities came up in I can start my video. And class and gender disparities took place in those last two papers. So one of the things that I think is great to think about is that sort of neurotypical discomfort with both stimming and Crip theory, and portraying that as sort of fears of this miscreant body. And so who has this language of stimming, who gets this language of Crip theory, and who gets to theorize? So does anyone have any questions? I'm just waiting on, and that is open up to our presenters as well. If you have any questions for each other, that would be really great. Hi, Andrea. That's okay. Feel free to type a question in here and I will pass it on. Okay, so okay, so is everyone, all three of our presenters, are you here with the video or audio? I can't actually see. Oh,
Hi.
hello. Hi. So we've got our first question in. So question for Izzy. Given that Amanda Baggs was operating in a US settler colonial context, does the notion of native offer more thoughts about otherness, or how we can think about those intersections?
I think that's a really interesting question. I certainly think that coming from the context that she does, obviously offers quite a different platform to someone coming from a perspective that isn't sort of the hegemonic language. And so I think possibly that there's room there to think about the juxtapositions of stimming in different linguistic contexts. So the difference between stimming in a context which is the hegemonic language, you know, the privileged language that is spoken by colonial countries with colonial histories, versus coming from a different context. And I actually wanted to hear from, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, was it Andrea, the last presenter? I really wanted to hear from her perspective on that, actually, because I think our two ideas really spoke to each other in terms of challenging these hegemonic accepted standards of how you can speak and where you can speak, and what kind of significance that has for discourse. I think that those two together are really productive. So yeah, I mean, I can't, it's such a complex, it's such a complex question that, you know, I think I'd need some time to address that in its totality. But I think that, sorry,
no, I've just noticed that there's an addition to the question I thought might help. So
okay,
particularly around the notion of native, which Indigenous folks in the US have had used against them and used themselves to describe a very particular sovereign identity. And also just that Baggs uses they, them pronouns, not she pronouns.
Oh, I apologise for that.
I should probably have known that, being the presenter, my apologies. So I think that in terms of I can't pretend to know, coming from a white context as I do, about the complexities of that question. I think that there are certainly a lot of people out there who would address that far more aptly than I ever could. But I do think there are certain discursive alliances there for sure. I think that there could be some really interesting overlaps and conversations to be had between Crip discourse and a whole host of others, like I gestured towards briefly at the end of my presentation. So yeah, I think that's definitely something worth paying attention to. But yeah, like I said, my presentation was intended to be very introductory. So I mean, if anyone, I mean, I can pass along my details to anyone who could enlighten me with more experience, coming from a different place than I am. I'd love to engage in those kind of conversations with people who know a lot more than I do.
Wonderful. And Andrea, can I ask, do you have anything to add to that? Especially because I've just seen here that thinking about the context that they come from and offering a different platform, thinking about stimming in a different context, challenging where you can speak and how you can speak.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry that I'm trying to not speak very loudly because it's 7:30 a.m. here.
Oh gosh, thanks for making it.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Actually, I was going to ask a very similar question, you know, about native language, or the use of the word native. Also because from what I know, I'm not that familiar with the languages and the history that has been studied about how can I say this? About the communities that were present before the settlers in the United States. Also, this kind of differentiation is kind of difficult because the United States and Mexico, where I am living right now, and where I am studying anthropology right now, has a very difficult history itself. So it's kind of complicated for me to say, this is the United States, this is the United States history, this is Mexico's history, these are the peoples before the Spanish came here. But from what I know, there has been research about the languages spoken before the settlers and how they were not just spoken languages, but they were guided by facial expressions, by hands and upper body gestures, movements. So I know that the word native is not necessarily used, and some people that are descendants from the original peoples that were in the United States oppose using it. I also think that this word can help us to understand what all the ways of communication that were there and that have survived. I think language, as it was mentioned, is not a very, it cannot be a fixed category. It has to be open. And through that openness, we need to understand that yeah, I'm trying to think about I'm trying to think of an example, but right now I cannot remember. And I can maybe later, maybe I can recall one. But yeah, I think well, about the presentation, I think Stimming can be a language. I think it is a language, but we have to be careful with certain terms and to know exactly where are we coming from when we are talking about um, Stimming as a language, because there have been languages across history that have used sensorial and corporeal elements. So it's located, it's situated in politics, in history, in a geopolitical context. Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Andrea. So we have another question here for Caroline. Your research examines heavily the exclusion of certain Crips and gender too. Can you expand more about how the very structure of the media and its related structures also is exclusive to Crips? In that, have you investigated the limits of representation? Great question.
Well, I don't know. I think one of the main things to me was that this notion that that there are so many people that are left out and sort of forgotten in the narrative of this supposedly really successful kind of like public campaign. So it's almost like kind of, oh, we dealt with disability, so big tick there, rather than sort of thinking that like within that framework there are so many different people and there are so many different identities that sit within that, and that just because you've represented some kinds of disability doesn't mean that you've represented the spectrum of diversity within that. And also this sort of notion that like that disability becomes the primary kind of marker and that you wouldn't necessarily identify with huge other aspects of your experience, you know, that your disability becomes the foremost thing rather than the fact that you're female or you're of a particular, you know, sexual identity. And so there was just this sort of idea that I think I was just trying to sort of strip down this notion that that this is a great thing that has achieved all of this like transformative representation within the mainstream media, but actually it's still excluding so many people and so many voices and so many levels of the kind of, I suppose it gets to that kind of idea about like the acceptable, you know, in terms of like Izzy's idea of like an acceptable language or the neurotypical language, that anything that sort of sits outside of that, they can't really handle, like there's no place for it, so it's just sort of silenced because it opens up a whole stream of other forms of communication or other forms of identification that people can't quite classify or categorize in a way that they can understand within a very sort of typical, accepted, structured language. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, that's great. And I definitely feel like that ties in somewhat with what you were talking about disability being categorized in terms of lack as well, like as though, you know, if you're thinking about someone's identity as all of these different parts, and then disability being like the primary focus in most of like these media ways of thinking about a person, you know, and then that idea that if they are being quantified in terms of their lack of something, how can they also be all of these other things? I don't know, but thanks so much for that. I think we actually have to wrap it up around now. I think we've got one last question here to Caroline. Is there any divide between acquired and congenital disability insofar as who becomes Paralympians? And this will have to be our last.
It's not divided in terms of who becomes Paralympians, but there's definitely a huge segregation in relation to who gets represented within the Paralympic marketing framework. There is definitely a kind of an evidenceable preference for the sort of this cyborg kind of identity, which is quite often correlated with this notion of an acquired disability. And I think part of that is also linked with this whole idea of like decoding, of classification, of like superheroizing certain characters. And it sort of falls to that idea that like what they're sort of pandering to is a public who can get their head around certain things. So like if something happened to you, something traumatic and terrible happened to you and you ended up disabled, what a horrific thing that could happen to anybody. And people who are born with a disability, there's not quite the same drama to the narrative in terms of like from a marketing point of view. And so a lot of those stories get kind of suppressed, even though there's loads of Paralympians where that's their story and they're not overcoming anything, like that's just their life, right? And but that can't be kind of heroized in the same kind of way, in a sort of very sellable, you know, they're trying to make it attractive to this mainstream market, right? So they're kind of targeting stories that have this sort of high drama, and that people who are often born with congenital disabilities don't have that high drama. Or it's like,
it's not something that's easy to say this is like a heroic overcoming of XYZ.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists and for those wonderful presentations. We're now going to move on to an intermission where you should please feel free to take a look at the digital gallery available on the website. We've got until about 2:15 for that, and then we'll be coming back for the second panel on healthcare. Okay, thank you so much and see you soon.
You.
Hi everyone, my name is Manishta, one of the co-organisers of this event. Welcome back, I hope you had a good break. Our next panel is going to be on healthcare, and it's going to be moderated by Archana Sekar from SOAS University of London. Archana is also a rights-based activist, writer, researcher based in Chennai, India.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me well. My internet is slightly patchy. I am Archana Sekar, and as Manishta introduced me, I am based in Chennai, India. I have an undergraduate degree in communications and a master in gender studies. And over the years, I've worked on homelessness, psychosocial disabilities, corporate accountability, and environmental justice. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel. And before we go on to it, I want to reiterate that during the presentations, please feel free to tweet using the hashtags Criposium and Criposium QA. If you want to partake in the Q&A at the end of the session, you can also ask questions by writing in the Zoom chat. And welcome to the day's second panel on healthcare. I'm very excited and pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Akanksha Mehta from Goldsmiths, who will present dialogues with doctors here and there. The trigger warnings include racism, sexism, fat phobia, medicalization, and gaslighting. Over to you, Akanksha.
Hi. Thank you, Archana, and thank you to the organizers and bringing us all together. I don't have a recording, so I have to go live, and I'm really sorry about that. What I want to present now will begin with a few dialogues that I've had with doctors here and there, and you'll see what I mean by that. As Archana has already said, there is a content warning here: racism, sexism, ableism, fat phobia in particular. So I'm just going to begin, and I'm going to read a few things the doctors have said to me, and then I'll explain what this is about. Are you on any medications back in London? Before I can make an appointment with the neurology specialist here, I need to update all your records from there. Chronic pain is difficult. Sorry to hear about that. But listen, I understand your depression. I used to be huge too, like you. Life is hard, but once you lose weight, the depression goes away. I would say just forget the medication that the doctors from over there have given you. Just focus on the gym while you're here. Let me stop you right there. We don't practice medicine like that in this country. Where you come from, over there, things are done differently. But we only practice evidence-based medicine. And I can say this with full confidence. Don't worry, my husband is also from there. He is Indian. Those are good suggestions. And your doctors over there will suggest these changes because they want to make money from you. But I would say the first and most important thing to do here would be to see a dietitian. I can see from your record that you have some history of depression. But what I want to tell you is, what is the point of all this? Doctors there have a passion for telling people they are depressed because they don't understand the universe like we do. The culture is different here from what it is there. So I would tell you, focus on starting a family, focus on integrating into society over here, taking care of your parents over here, instead of getting involved in all this depression and all this stuff over there. Ultimately, we all go to the final destination wherever we are. So don't choose depression there, choose family here. Look, the important thing is to make you feel productive and focus on small steps. I understand that you feel that this has become about other things, bigger things like the race stuff and the racism stuff and the sexism stuff, and all these political things that you are very sensitive about. But forget all that, be present here, micro steps to counter your thoughts changes one by one. I'm unable to recommend any treatment and counseling if you're unable to see how focusing on things that are not important to your health and don't have anything to do with it is what you need to do. Maybe it's best that you see a doctor where you're from. It might be easier to understand and treat you there. These things are usually always cultural. So last year, I wrote the piece called Dialogues with Doctors Here and There. It was a short piece for an anthology on mental health by writers of color that was edited and put together by students at Goldsmiths, the institution where I work. Kevin Batman and Farida Mumtaz were the students who took up this initiative and put together this anthology and got funding from it. And I'm happy to also share like online copies of this anthology if anybody wants to look at it. When I wrote this piece, Dialogues with Doctors Here and There, for me, it was an act of witnessing, of archiving, of narrating intersecting forms of ableist, racist, fatphobic, sexist violence, and the voicing of my despair as an act of not staying silent anymore. I took a deep breath and I pressed send. I fought a lot of internalized fat phobia and shame when I shared it with the world. And I thought I was done. I thought this was it. I had to write these things down and put them out there. But in recent months, I started teaching a new module at Goldsmiths, which is on violence and uses feminist, queer, decolonial Crip theory and centers all of that in how we understand and think about violence. And when I taught this module over the last few months, I realized that the short piece was not an act of conclusion of any kind, but actually just an opening for me to reflect deeper on the complex relationships between ableism, fat phobia, racism, queer and transphobia, and sexism. The piece from last year in the anthology included the dialogues that I just read out to you, but they also included what I was saying back to the doctors. It was me and the doctors both talking in that piece. But I decided to remove what I was saying because over time and over the last few months, I realized that it was irrelevant. My voice was not heard, my body minds not listened to, not even considered. So what was even the point of including my words in these dialogues? These dialogues can actually remain dialogues even if they are so-called one-sided and you only hear the doctor and not me. But what these dialogues have brought me to is to ask a series of questions or to think about a few comments that I should confess I'm still exploring. Of course, like most of us, when you apply for a symposium or a workshop or a conference, you think that that exploration will happen before you get there, but life doesn't work like that, definitely not on Crip time. So all I have here are lingering questions that I'm hoping to go forward with. And perhaps these can be an invitation for us to think together in the Q&A. So firstly, we know that the medicalization of illness, disability, pain is a form of violence and it's linked to histories and presence of control and power. But how do these intersect with the medicalization of fatness? What happens when they do? And how do we rethink fatness and illness with the dialogues that I presented to you? So in their piece, Coming to Claim Crip, Disidentification Within Disability Studies, Sami Shak speaks about how both fatness and disability are highly pathologized, both viewed as medical and or health issues located primarily in the failed body, mind, desire, behavior of the individual. So my first question to myself and to everybody would be to how do we take this further? How does this play out? How does the medicalization of illness and the medicalization of fatness continue to intersect in how we engage? Secondly, the title of my piece includes the words here and there. And throughout the piece, you keep hearing this invocation, this evocation of here, there. It gets confusing after a point. What is here? What is there? As these things keep shifting. The dialogues are both premised as well as placed together by me to make us think transnationally here and to center questions of race, racism, and whiteness. In their piece, Towards a Crip of Color Critique, Gina B. Kim invokes Audre Lorde to argue for the urgent need to draw out some of the possibilities of coalition between women of color, queer of color, feminist and disability theorizing, an alliance that they and many others have termed Crip of Color Critique, which is what we're discussing in this symposium as well. Crip of Color Critique allows us to think of these dialogues that I presented as a way to continue understanding that we can never separate racism and ableism. They constitute each other. Ableism and fat phobia are always already racialized, and race is constructed and articulated through ableism. As Khairani Baroka Oka reminded us yesterday when she gave a lecture at the Center for Feminist Research, she said, ableism is racism is ableism. Beyond that, there is room to think of the transnational in different ways, the evocation of the here and there in other ways too. The movement and shifting of power positions that we occupy and we are seen to occupy. In India, as an upper caste woman, which also means an upper class woman in many cases as caste and class work together, even the privilege of medical assistance with all its violence is through caste. My illness, pain, fatness, womanness is always infused with caste and is only occurring through caste. And in the UK, I become a body mind that is marked through race and brownness when I enter that doctor's room or even before. So how do we make sense of these shifting power positions in the transnational? The here and the there are both experiencing violence, but also there is caste privilege in one of these, and there is race in the other, and race and caste work together as well. Finally, the third thing that I want to bring up is the everyday experiences of pain, distress, and illness. What are the negotiations, conversations, and work that we are needing at once to survive in an ableist capitalist system, while also working towards its abolition to imagine and build a world of care? Here, specifically, how do we negotiate that we sometimes need to appeal to the medical or even have to rely on the medical to survive distress and illness? And as we do this, how do we not lose sight of our larger fight and imagination to enable worlds of collective care built on a liberatory praxis from all regimes of gender, sexuality, race, caste, class, ableism? This constant negotiation of everyday pain, where on one hand, you're working towards abolition of medical models, you're working towards building collective care. On the other hand, you're constantly asked to rely on the medical model, even not only to access doctors, but also say to access the institution like the university, where you need to constantly show evidence and proof of your illness in order to be accommodated and even given some kind of access. So I'm going to end with these kinds of questions, which I was hoping to have had more time to think about in the run-up to the symposium, but I didn't. But I hope that as I take this work further, or rather as we take this work further, we can think through all of this, because doing so is part of a political pedagogical project for me and for many of you, and it continues to remain deeply personal and lived. Doing so is also gratitude and acknowledgement to Crip of color writers, survivors, activists, communities everywhere. And doing so is yet another act of not staying silent anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Akanksha, for sharing such a deeply personal experience and putting us on the path to thinking about so many intersections and the ways in which so many violences intersect. And as you rightly put, what it means to not stay silent anymore, I think is something that we should pick up in a bit. We will now have Rihanna Walcott from King's College London presenting Banana Leaf Poultices. Over to you, Rihanna.
How does Black wellness balance mainstream healthcare with the holistic? Which areas of medical care are treated with suspicion, and how does that impact Black well-being? This is an excerpt from a chapter due to be published in the anthology So Hormonal, edited by Emily Horgan and Zachary Dixon, and published by Monstrous Regiment. In the excerpt I'll be reading, I share some of the interviews I conducted with Black people about barriers they have faced in accessing medication and healthcare, including facing stigma from their communities and neglect from health workers, in order to examine variant ethnocultural attitudes to medication. As the COVID-19 pandemic sweeps the world, my grandma tells me with some pride that back in Barbados, where the number of infections still remain in the low double figures and deaths in the single figures, people are returning to the old ways. An island of only 166 square miles and a population of less than 300,000, served by just 2 main hospitals, she reminds me that quick access to medical care on the island is not always possible or affordable, so in her youth, preventative and holistic medicine was a staple. Lemon, ginger and honey tea, sometimes spiked with rum for a cold, poultices wrapped in banana leaves and held firm to the body to draw out infection, a spoonful of foul-smelling cod liver oil or black seed oil a day, and the dreaded bush tea for a clear-out if you so much as fought in the vicinity of an elder. These are the medicines my grandparents brought with them from the Caribbean to the UK, the medicines of my parents' youth, and, to a lesser extent, the medicines of mine. As an advocate for BAME mental health awareness and support, not to mention a user of prescription medicine myself, my personal attitudes to mainstream healthcare are quite different to those of my parents and grandparents. I remain aware and critical of the ways in which healthcare systems underprivilege Black people globally and in the UK through histories of non-consensual medical experimentation on Black people during and after times of slavery, non-consensual sterilizations, disproportionate diagnoses and criminalization of Black people with severe mental health conditions, and even now, the disproportionately high mortality rate of people infected with COVID-19. Even so, while I still practice the familiar home remedies when I have a cough, I'm also perfectly happy to go to my doctor, albeit after applying a little extra pressure to ensure I'm treated fairly. My mum has fallen somewhere rather different on this spectrum. She's less likely to go to a physician than my grandma or myself, instead believing in diet and exercise as an all-round healer. My mum is diet-obsessed, easily captured by fads, and has a strange reluctance towards official healthcare systems. In her mind, most health problems are born of being fat, with disastrous consequences for me over the course of my lifetime. As a teenager with severe acne and a brutal period, following my doctor's recommendation, I asked for my mum's consent to be put on a birth control pill that promised to regulate both. Instead, I was put on an expensive course of Chinese acupuncture, cupping, and foul-tasting teas once a week after school. I've been on every crash diet, cut out every food group there is, tried myriad liquids, pills, and powders, and even been banished to a retreat my sister and I lovingly refer to as Fat Camp, a week-long vegetable juice cleanse that we spent in a fatigued stupor with furry tongues and beetroot-coloured stools. We each lost a stone of water weight that we regained with our first meal out of the place. Now an adult, I'm able to take more control of my own health, mentally and physically. I take antidepressants, antibiotics for my acne, and have been on various types of birth control, including the contraceptive pill and now an IUD. My mum still objects to me using all of the above because they are cosmetic, mental health related, and related to sexual activity, areas she would rather I treated with diet and exercise, or simply would not think of in connection to me. In a seeming contradiction, my mum has endless respect for doctors and would have been thrilled to see me become a proper one. And as my grandparents enter their twilight years, they visit doctors more frequently too. This conflicting logic had me wondering, what ethno-cultural factors make some healthcare issues acceptable and real and others unacceptable to Black people? How do Black British people balance mainstream healthcare with the holistic? In this chapter, I refer to two studies, one by Cooper Patrick et al. On the identification of Black attitudes to the use of medication and mental health services in the treatment of depression from 1997, and another by Thorens and more on variant socio- and ethnocultural determinants of drug treatment outcome, such as patients' expectations, attitudes, and adherence to psychotropic medication from 2008. I also asked several Black British people, some who have requested to remain anonymous and who I won't be naming in this presentation, about their experiences and histories of medication and self-medication as it relates to their families, hormonal treatments, mental health, religion, and contraception. One of the greatest barriers to accessing healthcare is unsurprisingly family and wider cultural opinion. Fears of family disapproval came up repeatedly in interviews, and more specifically, a pervasive cross-cultural suspicion of Big Pharma. In general, my family don't really like medication. Mum doesn't even like taking painkillers. They think natural and organic is best, and they grew up in Jamaica without access to some of these medications. Mum always has teas. I don't know where she gets them from, bush teas that she'll buy from friends, and herbs that she'll make into teas. She's a big fan of aloe vera, cod liver oil. She'll take vitamins, but natural supplements are always the way she prefers to go. So I've never had Lemsip for a sore throat. It's always been garlic tea. There are fewer side effects, and because it's wisdom that's been passed down through generations, they trust it. I think that the distrust for white colonial systems and medications means Black people prefer to use alternative, holistic, natural medications. We think they're more real rather than chemicals, and that they aren't part of a profit-based system in the same way drug companies may be. I also had bad eczema when I came to the UK, but I was never allowed to use steroid creams. It was always some other cream we bought from the market. We don't tend to trust healthcare professionals, and often for good reason. Once my sister had this really bad rash, and it wasn't getting better despite all of the things we were using, so my mom took her to the GP. The GP said they couldn't see it. This rash has been harassing my sister, as bright as day, but she couldn't see it. So as a result, my sister hasn't seen a GP in ages, and even now she thinks it's a waste of time. It takes so long to get an appointment to then be faced with medical racism, where they can't even see the rash on your black skin. Even me becoming a doctor hasn't changed a thing. I asked my parents, why did you send me to medical school if you don't believe a thing I say? They just say it's a good job. It's as though the things I can do are for white people, but not for us. For example, my dad has diabetes now. I've been warning him for years that he was likely to get it because of his lifestyle, his symptoms. Did he listen to me? And now, behold diabetes. They just don't respect Western medication in that way, whether I'm doing it or someone else. We know that Black people often suffer negative treatment outcomes from doctors, and being gender non-conforming negatively impacts that treatment even further. The negative experiences of Black people with doctors often comes as a result of historical and ongoing devaluation of our experiences of pain and assumptions that we over-exaggerate ailments, which leads to issues such as maternal mortality rate that is 5 times higher for Black women than white women in the UK, and racist medical textbooks that suggest Black people report higher pain intensity than other cultures and believe suffering and pain are inevitable. This means we often have to become our own doctors, carefully researching our own symptoms, treatment, and relying on the experiences of other Black people. Recently, I was put on progesterone. Because I've been taking testosterone for almost a year, I still have my cycle and I was going to try and stop it. I have a lot of concerns because I already have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is similar to an incredibly intense PMS. It's not very well documented and it makes you feel really suicidal. I warned my doctors about it, but they still put me on progesterone, which intensified the PMDD. I had to take myself off the medication, and it makes me feel really dubious about medication and healthcare. In terms of my journey with hormones, it can feel like there is a lack of care for Black trans people. Looking out for my own medical needs is necessary. I'm thinking I should have done more research into the side effects, but you expect your doctor to know these things and be looking out for you and know what to put you on and what not to based on your medical history. As a trans person, that's not a luxury I have. You have to become your own doctor a lot of the time. By far, the most common story we had was one related to mental health. Concerns about family opinion were repeated, as well as fears of side effects of mind-altering medication, and also a lack of positive examples among Black people of psych medication improving lives. When I got officially diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, it was a shock to my family. My mum and grandma were immediately really supportive and started reading about both diagnoses, but especially depression. I was already scared about taking antidepressants, I guess as an inherent cultural thing. I don't like taking tablets and was scared about the adjustment period. But my mum and grandma didn't want me to take them because they were worried about me turning into a zombie, being able to function but not being myself, or it having a long-lasting effect on my body. So in the end, I never took them and gave them to my friend one day who had run out of meds. Mental health is hugely taboo in Jamaican culture, and as I get older, I understand that a lot of the family members that were never spoken about probably suffered from severe mental health issues. My mum herself had very severe postnatal depression when she had me. She told me I didn't smile until I was about 2. I was a very serious baby. My mum and grandma were also both nurses within the NHS, and they have an inherent distrust of Western medicine, especially psych medication, because they don't think they've seen it work. They're also both Christian, so I had to take some time to explain to them both when I got diagnosed that prayer is great, but I was also going to need more action than that. The impact of religion in these interviews was mixed. Some condemned reliance on the church as leading to exploitation of desperate families in need, citing churches that offered to intensify the amount of prayer they do for your ailments, depending on the amount you donate. So if you donate £1,000, you get to sit at the front of the church, for £500, the row behind, and so on, exploiting the fear that doctors neglect Black patients and providing a financial alternative. Others took comfort from the word and challenged the view of faith as oppositional to healthcare. I think there's stigma attached to medication, where it's fine to take medication for your body, but less so for your mind. I'm a Christian, as is my family, and faith is one of the cornerstones of my life. Medication isn't a crutch, it's something I personally view as temporary, but often with faith you hear about people praying instead of relying on medication, and thinking that medication is in opposition to prayer. I don't see why they're pitted against each other. We don't think that God doesn't want us to take paracetamol. But for some reason, with antidepressants, we see it as oppositional to faith, which I don't understand. I found myself looking online and on blogs, trying to find someone who's Black and Christian and going through the same struggles, but people aren't always super open about it. I was searching for that assurance that it was okay to want to be on medication. My faith hasn't changed. I still get hope and comfort from the word. Often hand in hand with religion came reluctant attitudes towards sexual health and contraception. As far as vaccines, that awareness of Black people's historical role as guinea pigs for medical testing leaves many of us understandably reluctant to participate in medical treatments that are seen as experimental. Many Black people I know are already expressing reluctance to use the as yet non-existent COVID-19 vaccine in the future. The only vaccine that I remember not being allowed to have was the HPV one. And I honestly think a lot of it was just in the way it was explained to parents. And even in my class, loads of us didn't have it because it was just seen as the vaccine that you're going to need if you have sex, because HPV is a disease that's sexually transmitted. As far as Mum was concerned, you ain't having sex, so you don't need this vaccine. She felt it was encouraging promiscuity, especially because it was given to us at such a young age. I think the idea that this protects you for your whole life, even when you get older and get married it protects you, wasn't ever really explained. So my mum didn't let me have it for that reason. And because I wasn't having it, some of my friends were like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have it either. And they spoke to their parents and their parents wouldn't let them have it. These people don't think about Black families when they say, this vaccine is for a sexually transmitted infection. What's wrong with them? There was a lack of cultural competency in the way they advertised it, especially for a vaccine aimed at 12-year-old girls. On top of that, we were the first year to get it, and it felt like we were the test generation. And being Black people, with a history of having medical treatments tested on us non-consensually, having the power now to opt out, we took it. Maybe my parents were fine with vaccines that have been around for a while and been tried on lots of people, but to try out a new vaccine on her young child for something that, as far as she's concerned, I'll never have exposure to, it didn't make sense, and of course, I didn't question it. Black people's wariness of the healthcare system is consistently validated anew, and many of us continue to challenge medical advice we are given, turning to our own experts, our own networks of solidarity and resistance for information that takes our bodies, histories, and cultures into account. I know that my children will have their HPV vaccine and access to whatever contraceptives, medications, or whatever else they may need. I also know that when they catch colds, I'll be placing a few drops of stinging mentholated shilling oil on their pillows before they sleep, and rubbing Vicks Vapor Rub on their forehead, nostrils, throat, and chest. I'll let them skip the bush tea, though.
Thank you. That was Rihanna on Black British attitudes and barriers to healthcare and medication, pushing us to think through transnational, multicultural, and transgenerational experiences in, I would say, holistic health and wellness in a medically racist healthcare system. Jia Pandya from Princeton University will now present Yielded Bodies, Crippling Medical Research on the 1984 Bhopal gas tragedy. Sorry, I was muted suddenly. I'm just going to introduce Jia again. Jia Pandya is from Princeton University and will present Yielded Bodies, Crippling Medical Research on the 1984 Bhopal gas tragedy. The tags for this include Global South Disability Studies, Post-Colonial India, Medicalization, Crip Theory. Over to you, Jia.
Hi all. I want to start by thanking you all for taking the time to be here, thanking the Criposium organisers Manishta, Christina and Mel for their work, and thanking the volunteers and interpreters whose labor is making this possible. I also want to center the fact that this is a difficult political moment. We are seeing significant violence being enacted on Black, Brown, Indigenous, Dalit, Muslim and gendered bodies which are considered disposable, and also seeing many people being barred from access to health or care during a global pandemic. I think that the Bhopal gas leak and the aftermath of that tragedy offer an important space for us to understand and combat this logic of disposability ingrained in transnational capitalism. The Bhopal tragedy refers to one of the world's worst industrial disasters that took place in Madhya Pradesh, India on December 3rd, 1984. The US-owned Union Carbide pesticide factory leaked 40 tons of toxic MIC gas on its surroundings. An estimated 10,000 people were killed and 300,000 injured, But when we place the story of the tragedy in a longer history that accounts for events before and after the leak, the extent of the violence is greatly magnified. In fact, this longer history of Bhopal reveals how disability is produced by transnational capitalism through the assumption that certain bodies are disposable in its service. During initial negotiations with the US-based company, the Indian government foregrounded agricultural profit and foreign capital at the expense of its most vulnerable citizens. Meanwhile, Union Carbide used India as a site for experimenting with toxic chemicals that were strictly regulated in the United States. The factory promised employment to poor, largely Muslim and lower caste laborers who already worked in subpar conditions of the informal economy due to the lack of jobs. The factory depended on being able to dump toxic waste in the lake it was built near, even as many of the laborers and slum dwellers living there depended on the lake for potable water. While Amnesty documents that 30,000 people were permanently disabled and 200,000 people were partially impaired by the leak, most of those affected have been exposed to MIC and other toxic substances for much longer than one December night. In the aftermath of the leak, survivors received only a fraction of compensation funds promised in the initial press releases. Hospitals established by humanitarian workers and the government till date dispense health care to people who already come in with access to money and resources. The factory site, closed in 1985, has yet to be cleaned by the company, releasing toxins into the contaminated land and water that have intellectually, physically, and reproductively maimed generations of low-income Bhopali workers who live there. Despite the clear ways in which the Union Carbide factory, transnational economic negotiations, the gas leak, and its legal and humanitarian aftermath have produced and reproduced disability, disability studies as a field and disability justice as a movement have largely not incorporated the Bhopal tragedy. In this talk, I'm hoping to open space for that conversation. There are two main points I'm going to touch on about disability in the long history of the Bhopal tragedy. First, I'm going to use Crip methodology to show how ableist assumptions about disability are deployed by medical professionals and researchers in ways that demean disabled bodies and prevent Bhopali survivors' self-determination. Second, I'm going to highlight the work of Bhopali survivor activists, which offer alternative ways of understanding healthcare and Crip survival. This forms part of a larger research project which aims to build bridges between disability studies, disability justice, and Bhopali survivor activists. I'm happy to discuss this other research in the Q&A, as well as to share the citations and specifics of my arguments. To my first point, I want to clarify that Crip methodology, to me, means decentering identitarian frameworks of disability and moving past the white Western framework of disability rights, while retaining the field's commitment to a politics of liberation. Cripping holds on to the political potential of disability while paying attention to its material production, discursive deployment, systems of ableism, and the marginalization of certain body minds. I use cripping as a lens through which to understand how non-governmental medical research, itself critiquing the Indian government's inaction and hoping to help Bhopali survivors, deployed ableist logics, medicalized Bhopali survivors, and limited their opportunities for bodily self-determination. I examined medical and scientific articles, letters to the editor, and reports collected from academic journals, as well as from compilations of scientific literature by activists. What I want to highlight here is that attention to disability brings to light the ways in which academics, even those of us committed to supporting Bhopali survivors, can slip into patterns that prevent us from listening to them express their needs on their own terms. Cripping is not, therefore, a question of the intention of medical professionals. Rather, it aims to understand how our concepts and words around bodily ability have material impacts on people's lives. I found three main trends in how ableism and medicalized ideas of disability were deployed in this research. First, Bhopali survivors were described in diagnostic terms, making them legible only as medical subjects. Second, medical professionals placed Bhopalis squarely within the temporal framings of the tragedy, seeing them only as victims and evading possibilities for future-oriented survival. Third, this research emphasized a particular form of scientific expertise, which ignored the ways in which survivors can speak to their own bodily experiences. In terms of diagnosis, I found that this medical research often provided a long list of symptoms, illnesses, and affected body parts without considering more holistic care of survivors' bodies. For instance, one report described, quote, cases of hearts full of coagulated blood, end quote, while another described finding floppy limbs among developmentally disabled children. By isolating hearts and limbs from the entirety of these people's bodies and lived experiences, medical research reduced them to their impairment and evaded possibilities for thinking of more integrated forms of care. Moreover, Bhopalis were rarely named individually or even described as residents of the city, but instead as victims of the Bhopal illness, or worse, the gas affected. By making Bhopali survivors only legible in terms of needing medical attention, medical research contributed to silencing the broader, interconnected demands for survival in the face of violence. Secondly, regarding the temporal framing of the tragedy, I found that a lot of the medical research, including studies conducted 15 years after the gas leak, emphasized what could have been done differently that night, ignoring the fact that for many survivors, the persistent violence since that night has also been damaging, and that present-day survival and care are of equal importance. For example, calls for monitoring the medical history of gas leak survivors, attempts to isolate the symptoms they might have relating to MIC exposure from 1984, rather than recognizing the snowballing effect since. While industrial disasters must be prevented, a focus on the tragedy itself as a past disabling event ignores the need for conceptualizing a livable present and future for disabled Bhopali life. This is most visible in research on women with reproductive problems and children born with congenital disabilities. Scholars persistently recommend prolonged birth control measures, abortions, and invasive monitoring of childbearing women, constraining these women's choices over their bodies and implying that a child who might be born disabled can never have a livable future. I do not mean to demean the pain or sorrow of these mothers here. Rather, I want to bring to light the eugenic logics that make it impossible to imagine life with disability. And I want to foreground the importance of health work that prioritizes care, healing, and survival. Last, the medical literature differentiates between victims and experts, producing a notion of expertise that ensures that disabled Bhopalis cannot be considered specialists on their own bodies and lives. Researchers emphasized that qualitative findings from interviews needed to be confirmed through close monitoring and detailed clinical examination, showcasing discomfort with ways of articulating bodily experience beyond Western biomedicine. Moreover, scholars report suspicion of the survivors' descriptions of their symptoms for fear that they might be lying to get access to compensation funds. Casting poor, marginalized, disabled survivors as untrustworthy in describing their own experiences takes agency away from them. Additionally, medical professionals emphasize the importance of expert intervention in educating the affecting community in hygiene and sanitation practices, harkening back to interventionist colonial campaigns to modernize British India through sanitation. Scientific research thus demeans survivors by implying that they cannot know what they require, subjecting them instead to top-down solutions which do not accommodate a more holistic set of needs. I have argued then that a Crip reading of medical research in the aftermath of the Bhopal gas leak reveals the ways in which it expands the medicalization of Bhopali bodies and posits ableist healthcare practices that constrain Bhopali agency. I'm now going to turn to my second point, showcasing a different model of healthcare that emerged through the work of survivors and activists in Bhopal to highlight its potential contribution thinking about disability justice and Crip politics. Disability justice activists and Crip scholars articulate the importance of recognizing the desire for cure and warning the loss of ability, alongside the acknowledgement of the social production of disability and its political capacity for imagining a non-normative future. While medical professionals in Bhopal have focused on mourning and cure, local advocacy organizations and community healthcare initiatives like Sambhavna Clinic and Chingari Trust, which are built, staffed, and managed by a group of survivors and activists, offer more radical models of thinking about sustainable care. Sambhavna, for instance, provides to its clients free Ayurvedic and allopathic treatments, allowing them to choose any particular constellation of treatments rather than enforcing expertise. Sambhavna also maintains an herbal garden, which grows medicinal plants, as both a healthcare and community rehabilitation project. Sambhavna and Chingari both remain in conversation with medical researchers, but simultaneously create childcare and schooling spaces for disabled Bhopali children and their parents to live and survive with their non-normative body minds. Even as they have their own messy entanglements with biomedicine and other forms of power, what makes these essential Crip sites of survival is their emphasis on hybrid forms of self-determination and their encouragement of disabled survival in the face of the ongoing violence of transnational capitalism. So I argued in this talk that Bhopal is an important site to think about the production of disability and disposability by transnational capitalism, that cripping medical research can reveal its ableist restriction of survivors' agency, and that local survivor-led organizations offer essential models for disability justice organizing. I want to reassert here that the critique I am making of medicalization is not about whether these medical professionals intended to cause harm. My aim is instead to insist that researchers recognize and combat the violence we can commit, and that we work instead to support and amplify grassroots efforts towards collective liberation. I have ethical complicities of my own as I do this work, and I'm also painfully aware that this crisis, still impacting the lives of thousands of people, is compounded by the casteist and xenophobic violence of the current Indian state. My hope is that academics with economic and social capital will bring attention to the lived impacts of the gas leak, listen to and support Bhopali articulations of their own needs, and channel material resources towards Bhopali organizing efforts. I'm sending in the Zoom chat links to the pages for Sambhavna Clinic and the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal. Do consider donating to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia, for your presentation. You've given us a lot to think about, and we'll very quickly move on to the question and answer session now. I request all participants to participate. You can post your questions in 3 different ways. You can live chat. Sorry, I've got this here. You can post your questions on the chat in Zoom or on the live chat on Twitter. You can use the hashtag Criposium QA on Twitter, or use the form that's on the chat if you want to post questions anonymously. The presentations have given us a lot to think about, and there are many common threads. The question answer is also open to the presenters if you have questions to each other. I will be watching the space and take questions as they come. We've got no questions on the Zoom chat so far. But till then, I have a couple of questions to the presenters. Firstly, Akanksha and Rihanna, both of you touch upon a lot of trans-cultural experiences. Is there any sort of threads that you see in each other's work presentations, and how Gia's presentation on sort of transnational capitalism plays into the transcultural experiences of both of your works?
Well, I certainly found it really interesting to hear some of those conversations between, like there were a lot of similar threads in how doctors interact with people coming to, like with mental health issues as well. This is something that I've done, like had quite a few series of interviews with mainly Black people about their interactions with doctors. and sort of what that does to our ability to seek help. I think just to flag like a couple of the projects that I've worked with in regards to that, there's a lot of different projects at the moment that are geared towards making sure that you can seek better mental health support from people who share your background. So obviously we probably know about the BAATN, where you can find the Black and Asian Therapy Network in the UK, but also there are like, I'm working with this project alongside The Colour of Madness, which is the book that I edited. It's a BAME anthology about mental health that came out in September 2018. And since then, we've collaborated with a group called Project Neon, which is an NHS research project that is looking at the use of recovery narratives in mental health first aid. So the idea is that you go to this website, you answer a few questions about yourself, and then it matches you up to a recovery narrative that is similar to your own experience and might help. So being part of that project really has opened a lot of questions about like needing to see yourself in that, like understanding that there are different like ethno-cultural variants in our experiences, and that you can't even really lump them all under a BAME experience at all, which is, I think, like a really interesting thread of comparison between The Colour of Madness and the text that you mentioned. I'm now forgetting the name. I wasn't actually aware of it, but it seems like really, what is it? Invisible Voices.
Invisible
The Goldsmiths
Yeah.
text. Would you be able to like talk a little bit to that? Because it's,
Yeah,
I hadn't, yeah.
So Invisible Voices was a project that two students at Goldsmiths, Kevin Bathman and Farida Mumtaz, started. They're both students of color, to put it in a sort of like loose way. They were very tired of these conversations in the institution. So anyone who's been in an educational institution in the UK or elsewhere knows that the institution, you know, obviously does not care about your distress, but then performs this whole narrative of like how much they care about your distress, but does not listen to what you actually want, but offers you neoliberal solutions of like, hey, we're going to bring a puppy to campus like once a year, or, you know, we're going to put up these posters, be well, do well, stay well, that kind of stuff. And a lot of students, so I'm one of the few women of color teachers in my department, one of, I don't know, 3 maybe in a department of 80 people. And a lot of the students at Goldsmiths are actually students of color, Black and brown students who feel quite isolated in different ways, and not isolated because there are no like so-called services, but isolated because of structural racism and how it plays out in the classroom and on campus. So I had noticed that groups of students were starting to feel a lot of distress around the situation, and numerous things were going on in the institution at the same time. We had an anti-racist occupation that was led by Goldsmiths Anti-Racist Action, GARA, a group that occupied a building for 138 days last year, asking the institution for transformation and to think about Black and brown students. One of the key aspects of why the occupation happened and how it happened had to do with distress, mental health issues, other forms of illness, disability that the institution did not care about. And so at the same time, we saw students who also figured out a way that the institution cares about distress when it can make itself look good by giving you some money to do certain things. And so we also like were following this whole idea of stealing from the university that, you know, that people like Fred Moulton and Stefano Harvey talk about, like the university is never going to transform, but what you can do is steal some of its resources and do what you want with that. So these 2 students applied for a grant that was approved, and using that, they decided to put together this anthology called Invisible Voices, where they asked other students of color, and I was the only staff member who got involved in the project. And that also speaks a lot to like the way in which staff deal with students or not want to deal with students. And so they basically asked numerous, you know, BME, I don't like the term, basically Black and students of color, to write about their experiences. And that's how the anthology came about. There was poetry, there was art, there were short pieces, there were longer pieces, there were reflections, and they were all put together. And the copies were distributed on campus to whoever needed it. There are numerous copies in the Student Union, and actually I have some as well. And there's an online copy as well. And then we did an event to sort of launch the anthology and speak about the ways in which it created a community for us. So that was what Invisible Voices was about. And again, it was student-led effort. Like a lot of these things that are going on in institutions are being led by students who at one are experiencing massive distress and then are also having to find ways to cope and form community with very limited resources. Meanwhile, the institution continues to pretend that it's doing a lot for mental health. So that was what it was about. But I also wanted to pick up the question that you asked, Archana. One of the points of connection between Rihanna, your amazing presentation and your work, and what I was saying was this family thing that also comes up. Like you spoke about your mom in different ways and how those narratives, and these are like, you know, again, if you want to use the term cultural, like these are very cultural things that are going on in how Black and brown families also think about, you know, distress, fatness, illness, mental health, solutions to all of this or relief to all of this as well. So that was another point that I found really interesting, because some of your experiences resonated with some of mine, even though given our contexts are completely different and where, you know, we're not positioned in the same way at all, but still there was resonance in how these are shaped and how these are shaped by whiteness as well, and the ways our families respond to whiteness, or, you know, or even ally with whiteness sometimes. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, when I first was talking about mental health with my family, like in a really cliche kind of move, they found my antidepressants like the box in my bin, right? Which again does have you know, like impacts on like what is privacy inside of like a Black family. Like, what does that look like? Which I think is something that can again resonate across those ethnic differences. You know, the idea that like, whilst you might be an adult in this home, you're still not an adult. So, you know, finding that and then being told that I've gone away to uni and I've come back with a white middle class illness. So that was the way that they first began to look at mental health as an issue. And it's been something that has required quite a lot of work. And I think also one of the things that I wanted to come out of that chapter is the idea that we talk about generational attitudes towards mental health in a way that isn't quite accurate. So my grandparents, like when talking to my parents about mental health, it's all, oh, look at what the generations before you had to deal with, like, why are you turning, you know, this is actually like a white privilege in order to be able to talk about these things. But that's actually not the case when you go back that generation before, when my grandma is actually a lot more comfortable to talk about mental health and issues like that. So I think sometimes the language that we use to talk about you know, attitudes towards medication and healthcare kind of gets distorted between generations as well. And of course, you speaking about it getting distorted between the idea of like an other space versus within the UK, and like how those doctors interact as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like what you're saying about the distortion is also because of the neoliberalization of mental health, that, you know, like, because we're using this language that is a white language, I mean, that is, you know, situated in whiteness, and there is a dissonance there as well. And then our families can also say, well, this is like, you know, this is white stuff, like because of that mainstreaming and neoliberalization. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop.
Or even believe that they haven't been talking about mental health, or that it was never something that was spoken about back home, when it definitely is, but in different languages. So I've definitely seen a lot. I didn't get a chance to include the references in that PowerPoint, but they are available on request, and it will be published later this summer in an anthology, so it will all be in there. But some of the stuff about different ethnocultural attitudes towards medication and towards mental health definitely touched on the idea that talking about mental health in another space might be spoken about in a way that isn't like, oh, I feel anxiety. It might be, my stomach is in distress, you know, my stomach is distressed, or like, you know, like in ways that don't actively use the words that we're possibly familiar with in this context, but doesn't mean that we're not talking about it at all.
Yes.
I'm just going to jump in here. Now we are being flooded with questions.
Okay.
So, here's a question for you, Gia. Your work seems to take from Jasbir Kaur's deliberations on ensuring that the marginalized are perpetually at the margins of bad care and poverty. Can you deliberate more more on that and the Western/Hindu fundamentalist links.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Rihanna and Akanksha, for your presentations as well, and thanks for that question. I am definitely drawing on Jasbir Puar, and I think sort of where I think I have a sort of slight contention with Jasbir Puar in that I'm taking from her work to talk about the ways in which certain people and certain like senses of self aren't even legible within disability frameworks. So who doesn't even have access to saying what their experience of disability is, sort of who doesn't have access to the I. And I really like sort of I'm taking from her and Nirmala Erivalis there. But I think my sort of contention with Jasbir Puar is she's not actually accounting for disability activism and the way in which some people are striving towards making that sort of work legible. And so I think while I recognize that certain marginalized groups, and in this sort of particular case, Bhopal and Bhopali activists and survivors aren't even sort of legible to the framework of disability, I still want to bring disability studies as a conversation like into thinking about Bhopal, because I think that the sort of intersection and the speaking truth to power that disability studies and disability activism have can be really useful in terms of channeling material resources. So that's what I was saying. In terms of the Hindu fundamentalist link, I think that's also a really interesting question that I'm still figuring out. I'm a second year in my PhD program, and so the rest of my dissertation is going to be on post-colonial India, the national body, anti-caste struggles, how those are sort of relevant to disability organizing. And I think once I have a grasp more on what anti-caste, the intersection between anti-caste movements and disability justice movements mean, I'll have a better response to the sort of Hindu fundamentalist piece. There is a way in the sort of current political framework in India in which Ayurvedic medicine and sort of non-Western treatments are used as a way to demean access to care to a lot of populations, and a way in which the sort of Hindu notion of health or the Hindu notion of care are prioritized to describe the sort of long Hindu legacy of power in the country and cement like the logics of power for the current ruling party. So the sort of notion of Hindu science that has sort of bolstered the current like Hindu fundamentalist government. I'm not sure if I'm making a lot of sense. It's very early in the morning for me. But I think that we have to be really careful about how people in power or sort of groups in power co-opt the sort of notion of the alternative or the non-Western in support of sort of like other fascist claims. And so that's what I meant with the sort of Hindu fundamentalist piece.
Thank you for that, Gia. It's so sad that now we are having all these questions and this amazing discussion, and we are almost running out of time. I have about 5-6 questions in front of me, but there's one I'm going to take, and I hope all the presenters can very briefly sort of address this. Here's the question. How do you reconcile the two parts of POC cultures of healing and treatment? First, as a subversion of white colonialist medicine and as reclaiming community and generational knowledges and methods of healing. And second, it being used by older Black and brown members of our families as a substitute and a way to delegitimize medical help and support that we may need from these white institutions. I ask, the person who's posing the question is saying, since this is something I struggle with a lot within my family and community, and I know many others do as well. And just to add to this question, particularly to Gia, because the question I know has enough in it for both Rihanna and Akanksha to answer, but to Gia, where you're talking about medical and scientific professionals looking at the Bhopali survivors in a particular way, your thoughts on where this education is coming from, the ways in which scientific and medical professionals, even in the global south, are being trained by a certain kind of school of thinking, and what that means in also cultural contexts.
I think the question speaks to like exactly like one of my conundrums between thinking about the ways in which we end up needing to or having to rely on medical care of different forms, and at the same time wanting to, subvert, resist, abolish even those forms of medical care. I didn't think about this in the context of family. I was thinking about it more in the context of just the ways and modes of like survival and care available to us, where it sometimes becomes like you can't ignore the need for medical care, especially since institutions are constructed through it as well. So sometimes in the form of evidence, sometimes because there are no other options, sometimes to actually mitigate distress. And that is a key conundrum for me to think about it, because if we are looking at, inhabiting and building a world of disability justice, and inhabiting and building a world where we move beyond these necessities of medical care, but at the same time, we find ourselves having to deal with them or having to even use them. So I don't have an answer, but this is a key question. And this becomes complicated when you then invoke the family as well. Because in the context of, say, India, there are cases where medical care is denied to people because other forms of treatment or betterment are provided, but those other forms of treatment and betterment are actually constituted through very violent upper caste ideas of the body, very violent upper caste and sexist, misogynist ideas of the body, and hence they become another form of violence. So I don't know, I don't have an answer, but just that's a really good question.
Yes, I thought that was a really great question as well. Should I go now, or are you? All right, I'll go now. So that bit about the way to delegitimize medical help. It's something that I've really struggled with as well, with trying to, so I mentioned in my presentation that some of my family are already skeptical about a COVID-19 vaccine, even though it doesn't exist yet, because they are rightfully concerned about the histories of racism, even if they aren't putting it in those terms. That's definitely where the concern lies. They're thinking, and also we have all this evidence that suggests that Black people are on their own, and that we are currently, constantly being undermined by the government. And there's all these questions about, well, why are we dying in disproportionate numbers, especially when the messaging at the beginning of the pandemic amongst ourselves was that we were immune. I don't know if anyone remembers that moment, but there certainly was a lot of discussion about the fact that Black people are naturally immune. And I'm also writing an article at this moment that's going to be published with the Welcome collection about disinformation and WhatsApp auntie chats. So my research is actually around digital communication amongst Black and brown people. And one of the things that obviously has been really rife in the pandemic is people sending these long WhatsApp chats, forwarding to all the chats about, just any number of misinformation. So one of the, and also a lot of those tend to rest on these sort of, again, holistic ways of healing. So I saw a lot of things where people are sort of mashing together lots of different scientific takes, and also trying to bend it to their own understanding of what healthcare looks like. So I saw lots of stuff where someone said that garlic and watercress had a pH value of 27, which meant that if you ate loads of garlic and watercress, then COVID-19, the virus, couldn't exist in your body because the environment was too alkaline for it to exist. So there's a lot of people who benefit from that kind of misinformation. There's a lot of really horrible fear mongering that is very much targeted at Black and brown people who have reasonable doubts of mainstream medication. So I think what I found, and one of the things that I've explored in that article, is ways of making sure that you can keep your family on the straight and narrow and keep them safe without being overtly patronizing, or without discounting the sort of generational healthcare, the generational understandings of what healthcare looks like. So yes, it's a really difficult line to balance, and you know, there are certain things that are harmless and there are certain things that are harmful. So myself personally, I've been making sure that I debunk certain things. So when it leans on, because sometimes the ones that get taken as read or taken as like, this is why you should do this, they tend to lean on inaccurate science, but use it to mask this fear-mongering stuff. So, you know, explaining that the pH system doesn't go up to 27 is actually one way of getting them to notice, like, actually this can't possibly be a good message because it doesn't work. So you sometimes just have to debunk it in ways that are just really clear and flat like that says, yes, garlic is good for you, watercress is good for you, lemons and limes are great for you, but it's not, you know, it's not going to make your body inhospitable to a virus, because that's just not how it works. So it's sort of like towing this line between, no, there's nothing wrong with the things that you've understood, but also understanding that these things are being sort of disseminated in this time to scare you. And, you know, so that's kind of the awkward line I've been towing. And it's very difficult, actually, because yes, I know that a lot of people are using it as an excuse to not do certain things, but it just takes this sort of consistent conversation. It takes using people that they already respect and admire to like, you know, not just linking them to some white scientist that they don't care about, but linking them to someone else from their community that will, you know, say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And, you know, also that relationship between being like one of the younger people in the family and not wanting to contradict your elders and so on, that can be a really difficult thing to tow as well. And I know that when I was at the beginning of this, I was very frustrated, and I definitely went too far the other way, where I would just be like, this is fake, linking Snopes articles to people like about debunking it. And it's like, yeah, there's no way that my 70-year-old auntie who's forwarded this to the chat is going to sit down and read this Snopes article. You know, she doesn't care. So you know, it's just being really patient and making sure that you're making those comparisons explicit.
Thank you, Rihanna, for that response, and Akanksha. We really have to wrap up soon, but I want to hear from Gia before we end this session. Gia, any quick last final thoughts from you?
Great. Yeah, 3 quick thoughts. One, in terms of the sort of personal and family question, I totally echo what Rihanna and Akanksha have been saying. It's a really difficult line, and something that has helped me sort of reconcile sort of Western pathology with the sort of like home remedies that my family has been also just relying on a more expansive notion of family for myself, and making sure I'm finding community and chosen family to support me and my health in ways that are helpful. So that's just a sort of personal interjection. In terms of Bhopal and the sort of tension between Western biomedicine and Western scientific training, and then sort of Hindu medicine or Indian medicine, which is not the same thing. I think what's really interesting about Sambhavna and a lot of the activist work that's coming out of Bhopal is the fact that instead of trying to say, sort of pit the Western or the biomedical against the authentic and the traditional, it just uses a hybrid model. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. The sort of, as a historian, that's something I'm trying to hold, which is India experienced 200 years of colonialism. It's impossible at this political moment that we're going to find some sort of like non-colonial, non-Western form of training in science, because even the notion of science is steeped in so much history and colonial history. And so I think what is really powerful about the work coming out of Bhopal right now is that it, instead of trying to split the two, really puts them into conversation and works together. And in terms of sort of scientific and medical training, I would advocate building on a lot of post-colonial theory that sort of like hybrid training model is sort of one of the ways forward. And I'm not, you know, saying I have all of the answers. Yeah, I think that's what I meant.
Thank you, Gia. Thank you to all the presenters, Akanksha, Rana, and Gia, for this great set of presentations, great conversation, all of that. We need to close now. We're going to have a 5-minute break before we come back for the keynote speech. If the presenters are interested, have the access and the time, energy, we can move the conversation over to Twitter if you're up for it, but absolutely. The organizers will get in touch about that, because this conversation seems too exciting to end right away. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for being on this panel and presenting your work. It's been very, very, very nice. It was lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay, we will now move to 5 minutes break, and then we will have the keynote speakers to close this symposium. Thank you very much.
Akanksha.
Thank you very much. So for the next session is our closing keynote speakers, Olajumoke J. Abdullahi and Kim Oliver from the Triple Cripples. Just a content note for Black Lives Matter, racism, ableism, Grenfell, Windrush, Bailey Mujinga, UK, and George Floyd, USA. Thank you.
Yay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone.
I'm Kim, one half of the Triple Cripples.
And I'm Jumoke, the other half of Triple Cripples.
Wonderful. First of all, I would like to say thank you for this amazing opportunity. I've been listening in all day, and it's been such a fantastic experience, and everyone's contributions have been both thought-provoking and inspiring and made me question a lot of things. So it's actually great that we are able to kind of close it all off. Just in summary of some of the things, you know, Triple Cripples was started to highlight the narratives and increase visibility of disabled Black and non-Black women, femmes, and non-binary people of color. And this is because there is a lacuna, as Jay says, in the media landscape when it comes to representation. And I think the first person who spoke about representation in sports, right? And how we don't consider enough the effect of representation on the development, on the actualization of people, and the way it shapes our ideas, and it helps to, and it infiltrates culture, transforms culture, as well as what we believe about ourselves and the world around us. So it's great that there is work being done to recognize these ideas and kind of say, well, actually, no, representation is key. And it's not just about representation full stop. It's about the full representation of all our iterations as human beings, but particularly as disabled people. And if we think about Black and brown people being the world majority, not being able to see yourself reflected in all your iterations, not just when you're exceptional, or when you're seen as, was talked about earlier, as superhuman, but as being, it has heavy effects on not just your medical outcomes, but your social outcomes, your cultural outcomes, sometimes your religious engagement. And so it's been brilliant to be here and just listen to everyone talking about these issues that we were created for, if that makes sense. I think earlier, one of the things that was discussed as well was language, colonialism. Who gets to know? Who gets to decide who is radical? Who gets to decide what language is utilized in the way in which we see ourselves and see the world in these academic arenas? Who is the gatekeeper of knowledge? And when it comes to describing ourselves in non-Western contexts, in places that colonialism may have touched, but is not, the language may not be the primary language, how then do we see ourselves? How do we describe ourselves? How do we see activism? How do we see equity? Jumoke and I went to Ghana in November, and we were there for 3 months because we were like, well, you know, we know what it's like to be disabled women of different types here in the UK, but what is it like in a Black majority nation? And so we went with all our language, with our, you know, our activism language. We went with our ideas about what freedom and autonomy means within the context of a society. And we found that actually what we understood about life and the world in the context of someone who has a disability, and what freedom means, what equity means, what access means, is very different for people on the ground. Language, how we describe ourselves, things that we take for granted. You use the word cripple, and I'm so glad, I've forgotten the lady's name who spoke earlier, was talking about the word cripple not being effective in Spanish, in, you know, and in the same sense in Ghana, the word cripple doesn't have the same effect, right? And so it's thinking about all of these things and understanding that in order to decolonize our worldview and make the world a better place, we have to even challenge the modes through which we are being active and performing as you were, activism. And so it's fantastic that we've gotten this opportunity. I won't harp on, there were so many wonderful points raised, but I'll let Jumoke take over and just kind of summarize what we want to bring to you today.
Yes, thank you, Kimberly. Right, thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Jumoke, and what we wanted to talk about today, or part of what we wanted to talk about today, is of course everything that we've all been seeing going on in the news, on Twitter, on different social media platforms. And for those that have been able to go out and try and fight injustice through uprising and protesting, is the fact that we are once again rallying around the cry that Black Lives Matter. Now, for us, not only being Black women, but disabled Black women, it is important to note that whenever we are saying that Black Lives Matter, we have to be insistent upon the fact that we mean that all Black lives matter. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into a trap laid by white supremacy, because there's loads of those around, where we are only allowing certain types of Black people in when we refer to lives that are mattering. We must also include those that have disabilities. We must also include those that have queer identities. We must include our trans family. We must include those of us that are fat. We must include those of us that have different religious views to us, or no religious views whatsoever. And it's very important to emphasize the fact that we mean that all Black lives matter, because so often Blackness is used as a reason for punishing us. Now, the reason that we are punished, the reason we are punished might be because we are Black and queer. It might be because we are Black and disabled. It might be because we are fat and Black. Whatever, Black is the common denominator. So we cannot now be dividing ourselves along various axes. As the content was mentioned earlier, one of the things that we wanted to discuss is the way that racism and ableism is utilized to once again punish Black people. In the case right here in the UK on our shores, the murder, let's be very honest, of Belly Majinga was brought about, rest her beautiful soul, was brought about by somebody spitting in her face. Now, from the news reports, we had heard that Belly had mentioned to her employers the fact of her medical condition, that she didn't even want to go into work in the first place. But they decided that, no, you have to work. She said, okay, can I have a position where I'm not going to be front facing, where I won't be in the public, but I'll still be able to work? And they insisted upon the fact that she would be public facing. And of course, we all know somebody had spat on her face, and not long after, she unfortunately lost her life. Now, this is important to note because a police officer had also been spat on by somebody, George Crean, I believe, and he'd been spat on. Now, the person was found, the person was jailed, was sentenced to 12 months. Now, we are being shown that our lives do not matter at any instance, even when we are asking and pleading with those that are in the positions of power. It's like, I have this underlying health condition. This is not something that I wish to be doing. This is something that's dangerous for me. We are not being heard. Another way in which ableism and racism was utilized was tried to utilize is in the case of George Floyd in the USA. The first report that came from the coroner tried to blame underlying quote unquote health conditions and trying to assert the fact that it wasn't the fact that George had a knee placed on his neck for very nearly 9 minutes, but that wasn't the reason that he had died. It was owing to various concocted underlying health conditions that had caused his death. Now, for most Black people on whichever part of the world you're talking about, there is not enough money, there is not enough capital to be able to have another autopsy done. It was owing to the fact that uprisings were brought about because we do not believe Black people when we say we are dying, when we say we are in pain, when we say we cannot breathe, unless there is video evidence. And even then, there are those that will try to claim that it's not actually happening. It was owing to the fact that they were able to have another autopsy done. They said, no, it was in fact, surprise, surprise, the knee placed upon this man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that led to his death. The way that our skin color is used against us is in a myriad of ways. And the fact that we are disabled Black women means that it quite literally is, more so than our non-disabled family members. It's life or death for us. It is very important and very crucial that these points are very much highlighted.
And I think one of the things that was spoken about earlier was the idea of our intersecting identities not being separated from one another, because they are in operation all at the same time, all the time, right? And so it's important when we look at these things. So people say, oh, you know, well, this is an American issue. Well, not necessarily. Rocky Bennett in 1998 died at Norwich Mental Health Hospital, with 7 people holding him down, face down, for 25 minutes. They held him down and he died. That is not something that you would do to someone whose life you felt was relevant. That's not something you would do to someone and expect for them to survive, unless you had a bias that said, well, you know, they should be able to take this amount of force. They should be able to take this amount of pain. And also, will anyone care that this has happened to them? There are certain underlying biases and prejudices and hatreds and all sorts of things that affect the way in which we experience life. Sarah Reid is another example, being denied medication and ending up dead. Sean Rigg, 4 officers pinning him down for 8 minutes. This was in 2008. So it's not, the story of George Floyd is not a new one for the Black community. But what I guess we want to talk about and kind of highlight is the fact that when you have an invisible population who is invisible even within a marginalized population, what are the effects of these structural inequities on them? These are the reasons why we exist, why Triple Cripples exist. When we talk about it generally and we do our spiel, we talk about the increased rates of domestic violence and sexual abuse and femicide for Black and Indigenous femmes, right? And so we have to get to a point where all of our critiques, all of our radicalism is rooted in this idea that we have to start from the margins of the margins. Earlier we were talking about autism, and we were talking about the way in which stimming is viewed. And when you look at it from a cultural context, if we're diagnosing all of these things and understandings of neurodivergence in Western ideas of socializing and Western ideas of interaction, then we're not going to be able to accurately diagnose or understand when someone from a varying or differing culture is displaying certain traits. It's the same way you can't really find evidence of a lupus rash on Black skin online if you're trying to get diagnosed. The same way someone like my little brothers would be in a situation where people are saying, well, they're just difficult, as opposed to recognizing that actually within their home, they may not have been raised in an environment that would have even considered their differences. And so therefore they may have made adaptations, but are there these other things that show that perhaps they require more support? So what happens is there is a lot of lack of diagnosis. Sometimes there is overdiagnosis of other things because cultural and interpersonal interactions are misinterpreted because of these systems. So we're all about dismantling things. We're all about bringing about representations that we can better understand the world as in a holistic way, the same way we were talking about earlier, you know, bringing together what we would call Western medicine, or the ideas of Western medicine, and holistic medicines from our nations of origin, or from other cultures that perhaps use a more, my father calls it compound based, but it just natural herbs and medicines, and kind of looking at how both of those can complement each other. Because drinking ginger tea is not going to be able to help me get a tumor out of my leg, but it might help reduce inflammation, and then I need a surgeon to help get the tumor out of my leg. And it's understanding that all of these worlds and cultures need to be included in the way in which we see the world. Black and brown people are the majority. And so for us to be completely disregarded, and especially femmes to be completely disregarded, is actually a loss for the world in terms of development and understanding a better future, I think. So, Jimmy, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Something we always try to reference is the fact that it is both disingenuous and plainly a lie to say that there's a difference between the racism that is viewed on the news and throughout media in the US is completely different, or more so overt, than the racism that is faced here in the UK shores or anywhere else in the entire world. The racism that we see constantly and consistently being displayed in the US was very much born here in the UK. It's like the UK were the teachers, or one of the teachers, of the racism that we are now seeing being displayed throughout the US nation. And it is often, there's often said, and has certainly been said by me, that the racism here, you know, it's a little bit more covert, it's a little bit more subtle. But having the disgusting examples of Grenfell, of Windrush, like these are very clear tales from the government that's supposed to be here for everyone, that, hey, we do not want you, even after the fact that we have put out international adverts begging for you to come here and help rebuild our nations. We do not want you here. You are seen as a cur. You are seen only as useful as I can get value out of you, what I can get out of you, and the contributions that I feel are worthy. If, like many of us here participating are from the UK, watching the news, seeing Grenfell Tower on fire, people literally calling out, begging for their lives, going on social media, trying to get in contact with friends and family, and just knowing the fact that they were in those particular situations was because of the color of their skin, let's be very honest, was because they weren't seen as to be able to contribute to, and their class. Yeah, it was certainly class, their color. They were seen as the undesirables, but they're undesirable in the sense of, I do not want to spend on you. I do not feel that you are worthy of being spent on. However, I do see value in you being useful for me, because those that are on the left, so claiming to try and fight for those that are fighting for equality and for justice, what they usually spout is, well, if they go, who's going to pick our fruits? If they go, who's going to clean our toilets? If they go, how is my life, my very privileged, very, very often white life, how is that going to be impacted? We are only viewed in the ways in which we are able to contribute. Now, these ideas that we see unfolding in the US, they are very much alive over here. Us having both grown up here in the UK, having gone through different British institutions, most notably the NHS and healthcare, racism is very much still alive. So it would be doing a great disservice and injustice to those that have passed before us to say, oh no, you know, it's just an unkind word here, it's just a look there, it's just a glance there. Sometimes over here as well, it is a neck, it is a knee on your body.
And it's a matter of life and death. I think one of the things that we fail to recognize is that the UK has an amazing PR machine. Most people don't know that the prison population, in terms of disproportionate imprisonment and disproportionate charging and sentencing, is
And such.
Over here, it's greater than the percentage in the US. A lot of people don't know that because we are amazing at crafting this image of the great empire. And we rarely question it. And it's very easy to point a finger at someone else. An example would be the way in which, I mean, this Criposium has been the most diverse, I guess, disability conference style thing that I've experienced in my little life as a disabled person. Most of them are dominated by white voices, right? And the panels are filled with white voices, and that voice is prevalent. And should you dare to say that your experience is perhaps different, and perhaps you know, the way I experience healthcare might be different from you, you are silenced, you are shouted down, because of course I'm disabled. How can I be racist? Which is not true. You can be disabled and racist. You can be poor and racist. You can be anything and racist. You can be anything and sexist. As we know, like, misogyny is not just perpetuated by men. It is also something that can be perpetuated by women, because we've been living in a society that tells us our value, and therefore we attribute that value to others who are like us. And so it's very important that we're constantly questioning these things. I don't want to end our our speech on kind of a challenge and say, like, you guys need to go out there, you need to be talking about Black issues. No, but what we're saying is that we need to be open to learning. We need to be open to unpicking ideas that we, even as marginalized people, feel are fact and true. We need to be open to learning that there is more beyond our personal perspective, and recognizing that in order to empower ourselves, we need to be invested in empowering the most marginalized people in our communities, not just in the UK, but globally. We need to be willing to do the work and research and listening and learning that it takes to accommodate those perspectives, and also putting ourselves standing in the gap on behalf of our land, right? On behalf of the world that we live in. We are the drivers. Queer, disabled folks of color are the change makers. They've always been the change makers. And so I guess what we're saying is, let's not stop now, right?
Yeah, and just to emphasize the fact, that's why we created Triple Cripples, for this very purpose. We're very aware of how powerful and huge the media machine is, and in order to be able to affect these changes, you have to be able to get your message out, and that's what we are also trying to do, and getting our message out to the global majority, and ensuring that it's not just the voices of those like us that are in the diaspora, but that we're also learning from and realizing that we're fighting for all of us that are around the globe, those in different continents, and the fact that we need to learn from each other and fight for one another as well. Because if it's affecting a Black person in the UK, it's affecting a Black person in Jamaica, it's affecting a Black person in Ghana, it's affecting a Black person in Brazil, in India, wherever they might be. It's affecting all of us brown and Black people. And we need to ensure that we're not just fighting these fights in little silos, that we're not being myopic, but just trying to look at the bigger picture, because we're all just trying to fight this one thing. So, yeah.
Awesome. I think we need to go to the question and answers. Does anyone have any questions? They can be about anything apart from Jay's dating life. Let me see.
Yeah, you have a look for us.
Yeah, I'm having a look. I think you can type your questions in the chat, but the person earlier who was talking about language is Andrea Gómez. Their research is actually quite fantastic, and I would like to connect with them. So if you want to know about activism in South America, I think their research was about activism in terms of disability activism and understandings of it from that perspective. That would be amazing. Question.
Look what you said him. What's with Jay?
What's this question? Question. What's with Jay's dating life? Josh Woodworth. That was just me trolling her, because we have one of the things that is really cool about Jumoke and I haven't been disabled my whole life. Jumoke has been disabled most of her life. And one of the things that we found is that though we are both Black disabled women, there are lots of differences between us. However, there is also a lot of kinship and a lot of things that are none because of our cultural backgrounds. There are lots of unspoken rules, regulations, ideas, stigmas, tropes that exist within our cultures. I'm half Caribbean, half West African. Jumoke is West African, that we wouldn't be able to express to someone else. There are lots of those things that are unspoken that we couldn't express to someone else, but we each get because that's our experience, right? And so I think that has been one of the biggest learning experiences, because I think the homogenization of Blackness is I just saw the question. Actually, on dating, this is
yeah, we talk about it on our YouTube channel. We do discuss dating.
Okay, so Manishta asks, actually on dating, what are your experiences of being queer and Crip? Can you expand on the microaggressions? As my experience, I don't think Jumoke is queer. If she is, she hasn't told me, and if she is and she hasn't told me, we'll have a big discussion afterwards, because we're supposed to be really close.
It's not even a discussion, it's a fight.
But as myself as a queer person, and becoming disabled and being disabled and living in the community, one of the things that's been the most difficult, I guess, has been finding spaces that, especially as a queer person of color, finding accessible, safe spaces for socializing with the queer community. Often the places, because of lack of funding, racism, a lot of people of color who have these queer spaces, they have to have them where they can afford. And often where they can afford, if you're talking about particular social events, they are places that haven't been built to be accessible. I'm a wheelchair user, and that has been one of my main issues. But the second one is that actually there is as much ableism, not as much, there is ableism within the queer community, though I've found it to be more accommodating and people have more expansive understandings of the different ways of being. There has been, and perhaps it's my own ideas about who should be more open-minded based on their own protected characteristics, right? So I have these expectations that ableism won't exist as hard here. Anti-Blackness shouldn't exist as prevalently here. Whereas I've gone into spaces and ableism is rife, anti-Blackness is rife. Sometimes misogyny is rife. And so those have been my difficulties, kind of reconciling the fact that regardless of whether I'm queer, I'm Black and a woman, I'm still disabled in certain spaces. And that in itself can sometimes be a barrier for equitable interaction. That's what I'll call it, equitable interaction. And you will face the same, sometimes, ignorance that you face in other spheres. But outside of that, it's actually quite cool. You are an anomaly within an anomaly within an anomaly. So, and I personally like being the exception to every rule. So it's also
I can
wonderful.
attest that she does like being the exception to every rule, because God forbid that she's not special.
And an anonymous question, let me see. We ask, oh, okay, I cannot see the question. Oh, they were saying that you could ask an anonymous question. So I just can't use technology, don't worry. That's me being Zoom.
You're doing your best, babe.
Zoom inefficient.
You're doing your best.
Jumoke, what about you in terms of your experiences of dating as someone who is non-queer and being in the dating world, as a Black woman, as a Black West African woman, as a Black West African Muslim woman, what is your take? What has it been like for you?
It's all right.
Since we're on the topic,
no,
I'm curious.
You're curious. Like I did mention earlier, like seriously, like we talk about sex, dating, and relationships on our YouTube channel. But one thing I do think is important to note is that the way that Kim and I do speak about these particular topics, it's how most people would speak with their friends or sisters about these particular topics. You know, it's just kind of like, wow, I had a really crap day. Let me tell you about it. Or wow, this person actually thought, you know, turned out to be a lot more interesting than I had thought. Let me tell you about it. And
never the case.
Yeah, unfortunately, do you know what? Let's end on a nice note, a very nice note. But you know, it's just it's important for people to just see, again, which is why we try to embrace the fact that we are putting ourselves in videos and whatever, and people are able to physically see us, that there's nothing different that you should be expecting. It's like the kind of conversations that you would have with you and yours are the kind of conversations that we have together. And yeah, man, triple cripples for life. What's up?
So we have to wrap now, but if you do want to continue the conversation, I think it's being had on Twitter, and you can use the hashtag Criposium. And I think Criposium QA, if you want to ask questions. I think the earlier panel, the health panel, are going to be on there, possibly answering questions from the previous panel. A lot of people had questions, so continue there. If you have questions for us, you can use the hashtag triple cripples and just tag Criposium in there as well, and we are happy to answer them. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
If you don't want in public, like, you can reach out to us via our website and contact us that way. If you're like, I don't want my handle attached to this, so you can reach out to us that way as well.
Yeah, I'll put the website in the chat, but it's been awesome being part of this, and congratulations to everyone who put this together, Christina and Manjita. Like, it's been a beautiful experience, and thank you for everyone for coming, and make sure that you follow every single person. Yeah, get in contact with all the people who have been, and interact with their content and their research, because learning, that's what we all need to be doing, but also just community. It takes all of us to make the world a place that we want to live in. It's not about just the future generations, but it's also us who are actually here as well. So thank you again. And hopefully we'll see you all soon at some point. Big love to everyone.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for attending Criposium, a 2-day virtual symposium on disability and intersectionality. This event was aimed at provoking conversations that challenge hegemonic discourses of normalcy. We wanted to explore how ableism intersects with other forms of oppressions, such as racism, sexism, transphobia, queerphobia, and class inequality. We wanted to bring in academics, activists, and artists in our conversations. We have done so by providing spaces for academics to engage with artists and activists on our panels and our virtual gallery. Importantly, our speakers have highlighted the intersections of Crip with issues of race, migration, gender, and sexuality. Our aim for this event is to open up a discussion on how normative paradigms of power impact on those who experience intersectional discrimination. In bringing together artists, activists, academics, and students, as well as disabled people together, we have shown that the solutions to counteracting sexism, racism, queerphobia, transphobia, and ableism is to understand them as interlinked, transnational, yet localised. We hope you enjoyed our virtual symposium.
Due to the global pandemic situation, we have not been able to secure as much funding as we would have hoped. Part of the integrity of our work relies on properly valuing disabled contributions and work, for which fair payment is essential. We have launched a crowdfund appeal to support the Criposium and all of its speakers and interpreters. You can find the details for this on our Twitter and Instagram. Alternatively, you can search for Criposium on the GoFundMe site. We are especially asking for those who are abled and financially privileged to support our endeavours to pay all our speakers and BSL interpreters a fair wage. Due to the egalitarian ethos of our work, we have strived to make our events as accessible and as inclusive as possible. In order to carry on improving the access, the inclusion, and the equality of our work, we are really keen to hear your views. We will set up a feedback form, and this will be sent to all who are registered. Alternatively, you can email us criposium@gmail.com with the subject feedback. Once again, thank you so much for attending. We really hope you enjoyed it.
We would like to thank our financial contributors, the SOAS Centre for Gender Studies, the Decolonising SOAS Working Group, and the English Department of King's College London. I would especially like to extend our thanks to Dr. Awina Okesh, Chair of the Centre for Gender Studies, for her advice and support, Maya Goodfellow from the Decolonising SOAS Working Group, and Professor Neil Vickers from King's College London for his ongoing support. We also thank all other staff and students at SOAS and King's College London who supported our work. Warmest thanks to Dr. Yasmin Gunaratnam for her suggestions and solidarity during this process. Thanks to our British Sign Language interpreters, Ali Gordon and Sandeep Dio, for their patience and hard work. This has been a long process and we have had to deal with a lot of changes. For that, we'd like to extend our appreciation to our speakers, artists, moderators, volunteers, and participants, without whom this event would not have happened. To the audience, thank you. To all, goodbye.